China's appetite for energy is enormous. The country consumes about a quarter of the world's energy supply, 35% more than the US annually. Its energy needs have more than tripled since the year 2000. That consumption has helped to fuel astonishing growth, but it's come at a cost.
China is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. There is no way to tackle climate change unless China reduces its emissions to net zero.
The country's reliance on fossil fuels is also a hindrance to its own growth and the well-being of its citizens.
China is not energy secure. It has a massive import bill for things like oil and gas. It has a long-standing pollution problem, and it is also prone to outages that severely hamper industry.
All this has led the world's biggest polluter to take steps towards a radical transformation.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Live from Jackson Hole, Wyoming this morning. Good morning. Counting you down to an address by the Fed Chair Jay Powell taking place at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. local, and that beautiful little walk, Tom, where they walk towards the fence.
They're going to do the walk. We're going to do
What's
a practice walk
What's the
of
walk
it.
about?
The walk is about the international nature of this. It's really important, and there's been times where it's actually been dramatic. The walk, John, the walk in 2000, that's a surveillance moth flying around. There it is. His name is Pivot. We named him Pivot. John, the walk of 2007 was emotional. We were flat on our back 10 days after we blew up, and there was an international response. But it's turned into sort of
comical.
Yeah, you know,
is that your royal wave? That's your royal wave?
No, that's my, you know, I don't know if it's,
okay.
I don't know if it's Cambridge or Sussex. It's
I'm not sure what's going on with that. Okay, here's the price action this Friday morning. A good morning to you all. Equity futures are lower by a third of 1% on the S&P 500, just a little bit softer going into this one. Down on the session, down on the week. If you check out the bond market just briefly, you will notice we're very, very close to the highs of the year on a 2-year yield at 338. Yields up about a basis point. On a 10-year, up 5 basis points. Still some way off of the highs of the year. Steve Major of HSBC on this program 20 minutes ago saying we've seen the highs of the year on a 10-year. In the middle of June, that was it. Right now, just short of 3.1%. I'll finish on foreign exchange. We will hear from the ECB. Schnabel coming up, I believe, tomorrow, Lisa. Euro-dollar at the moment, just north of parity. Positive by about 0.4%. So a stronger euro in the mix, Lisa, going into this one.
Yeah, but the stronger euro has not a lot to do necessarily with what Isabel Schnabel or anyone at the ECB is going to be talking about, because we're currently pricing in the most hawkish stance over the past decade for the ECB, and it is not what is driving the euro action.
Got to talk about the UK as well. Tom, you mentioned this a little bit earlier. The price cap on energy bills is rising in the UK. We were anticipating this move, but this number, Tom, $4,189. That's going to begin in October, so that's $3,449 local in sterling. And I want to give you an idea of how much that's going to change for the average family. When you put on the dishwasher in the UK, that one cycle last winter, 40 pence. That cycle now is going to be more than £1. Our team here at UK broke this down. Our UK team broke this down for us. You think about the dryer. You put the dryer on, the clothes dryer for a cycle.
Yeah, it never stops at my house.
It's going to go from 80 pence a cycle to more than £2. That's a big, big change for a lot of people. That all adds up. We're going to have a situation, Tom, where I don't know what's going to happen. Are people going to basically say, I can't afford to spend this money on utility bills and stop heating their homes? Are they going to stop paying their bills? Are they going to stop spending elsewhere to enable them to pay their bills? It's a difficult moment.
Or is the government going to step in and say we have to spend a lot more to plug that gap? And then what does that do to the deficit?
And right now, Tom, what government?
And what government is the real question here, I think, within the debate. The lack of leadership of voices in the United Kingdom is pretty soft right now. Speaking of leadership, at the London School of Economics, and of course, is a former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, Sir Howard Davies joins us this morning for, I think, with Jason Furman, our two most important conversations of the morning. Sir Howard, thank you so much for joining us at Jackson Hole. You stopped me with your Guardian essay of the other day, where you reaffirm the Olivier Blanchard 4% inflation of another time and place. His colleague Adam Posen says, well, okay, maybe 3%, but why are we still talking 2%, as we will hear from Chairman Powell today? Is a 2% level of inflation dead?
Well, my concern is that getting down from where we currently are to 4%, one can see a route there involving some increases in interest rates, obviously, but also as if we assume that energy price rises will not remain as they are now, then we can start to see how we might get back. I think that the pressure to get back down to 2% is going to involve some very unpleasant decisions by the Fed and indeed by the Bank of England. And we may just not have that political support. So what I'm concerned about is that on the current regime, the central banks are set up to fail. And I think that would be a bad outcome, and then would be putting at risk their whole basis of independence. So I'm wondering if we can't find a way of softening this and saying, well, we can get back perhaps eventually to 2%, but in the meantime, maybe we allow and provide for a slightly higher target in the adjustment phase. That's really my point.
Something you're really quite good at, which is giving a speech and finding that single sentence which resonates. What is a single sentence that Chairman Powell has to state this morning to resonate with economists and also the listeners and viewers of this show?
I think he has to say that he is determined to meet his full mandate. That means aiming in the medium term for 2% inflation, but take account of the impact on employment, which currently is not too serious, but which over time could cause him to moderate the pathway towards his target. I think perhaps it shows that I haven't quite thought about this in the way that you requested, but some message along those lines to provide some conditioning for the pathway, which I think otherwise, if you're just too aggressive, say we're going to get to 2%, don't worry, nothing is going to stop us, we're going to get there as soon as possible, I just think you're setting yourself up to fail. So I think you've got to find a framework which allows you to get back to your target, but to do so taking into account the impact that you're going to have on the employment market.
Howard, is this possible? And I ask this because a lot of people are questioning exactly what you are, whether political interference will stop the Fed, will stop the ECB, will stop the Bank of England from raising rates as much as needed to bring inflation down to their targets. Does this mean that there's the much greater risk of inflation getting out of control, that they're more willing to take that risk than the political risk of really causing a deep recession?
There's undoubtedly that risk, and I've got to say, preface everything I say by saying that this is a great, great time to be a former central banker and not to be a current central banker. Undoubtedly, there is that risk, and that's what informs my thinking, that somehow we have to find a manageable pathway down to a lower level of inflation, which politicians will support. And the risk is that if you go for too much of a cold bath, then you will lose the consensus basis for the support that independent central banks have. And it's no point in just looking at your constitution and saying, you know, that's what we've been mandated to do. Because if you lose political support, you know, you can whistle for it. I mean, something nasty will happen to you. So I think that's what they've got to do, to find a realistic pathway and one which politicians can say, well, look, we know there's going to be some pain here, but the central bank understands that, and they're not going to do it in such a way that we just bring the economy crashing to a halt in order to achieve their inflation objective. That's what they've got to do, to try to build some consensus around a sensible pathway.
Well, but Howard, Howard, a sensible pathway, what does that look like if you're talking about the Citigroup 18% inflation rate that they see as the potential peak for the United Kingdom?
That's been a very unhelpful intervention. I don't really see much basis for what they're saying on 18%. They've got themselves in the headlines, and maybe that's what the analysts of that bank particularly wanted to do. I think that's a very, very unhelpful intervention all round. It isn't where the Bank of England think we're going to be, so I dismiss that. But I do think that you can look at the pathway the
Howard,
Bank of
I've got
England...
to jump in. Forgive me, Howard.
Yeah.
Howard, I've got to jump in. Are we saying if something's not the Bank of England, if the Bank of England's not forecasting it, it's an intervention we can ignore? Is that how we should describe the South side when they come out with inflation forecasts?
I think this was a marketing piece of research.
What do you make of that, Tom?
You know, I think that there's a lot of criticism here about the over-analysis of it right now. That's all there is to it. It's front and center. You know, that's all there is. Howard, if I can get in one more question here very quickly, which I think is so important. We had a fiscal impulse because of a global pandemic. No one's talking about the number of years it will take to diffuse that fiscal impulse. Are we delusional that we're thinking from Fed meeting to Fed meeting, or quarters, or 1 year, or 2 years? Is it going to take years to diffuse the fiscal boom we've experienced?
Yes, I think it will take some time. I think what will drive it is that the governments have been able to engage in significant fiscal stimulus because the debt interest line has been very small. And that's changing. And we're already seeing in the UK, and I'm sure people have done their arithmetic in the US as well, that debt interest payment is going to take up an increasing share of government expenditure over the next 2 to 3 years. That is going to put severe pressure on other forms of public spending. So there will, I think, be a fiscal retrenchment. Governments don't particularly want to talk about that at the moment, but I can't see any alternative. Mm-hmm. It is, however, going to take quite some time to get back down to a sensible fiscal balance in the UK and elsewhere.
So Howard Davis, thank you, sir. It's always wonderful to catch up with you. Brilliant. So Howard Davis is far better placed than I am to decide what forecasts he wants to pay attention to and what forecasts he would choose to ignore. I was merely just suggesting that for a lot of people, the Bank of England would be the last forecaster of inflation that many people would want to follow.
Okay, they've gotten it wrong many times over again, but Wall Street has as well. So that's fair. We have to throw, cast doubt on everybody's. However, this is sort of an interesting allegation, basically saying it is a marketing ploy of Citigroup to come out and say that 18% could be the peak inflation rate for the United Kingdom. How much is that really how central bankers can dismiss some of these projections, or do they have to take them seriously in what they do?
They're now forecasting 13%, aren't they?
It's pretty high as well.
We're now already at double digits. Where were we 12 months ago, looking 12 months forward? I've heard from Citi in the last 5 minutes or so, from Andrew Hollenhorst. Not connected to this, though. The message came before those comments. I'm sure he's got something else to say. He said, the team at Citi wondering if this is a surveillance survivor crossover.
Well,
this is a
that's important.
Crossover.
This is the issue here. It's right here, folks. This is my turkey stick, and Pharaoh won't let me open it because Grizz from 4 miles away. Let me do that right now, John.
He has bear bells on.
Okay, you're going to eat that right now.
I'm going to eat this right now.
Nobody
Bring
needs
in the
to see that. No,
futures are positive on the S&P rather than negative. I'm so distracted
I'm too cold. I can't open it.
Survive.
On the S&P. From Jackson Hole, Wyoming this morning. Good morning. This is Bloomberg.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Ritika Gupta. Germany is considering restricting the companies able to benefit from a new gas levy just to those that really need the help. The government has faced scrutiny following an outcry over soaring profits at some energy companies. Germany initiated the plan over concerns that failures of gas companies could trigger wider disruption in energy deliveries to Europe's biggest economy. India is set to curb some of its rice exports, a move that could cause trouble in global food markets. Bloomberg has learned the government is considering the move as local prices soar. India accounts for 40% of global rice trade, and restricting exports would deal a further blow to countries grappling with a cost of living crisis and worsening hunger. Hong Kong is reinstating some of its COVID-19 curbs beginning Sunday as cases soar in the city. The government will increase testing rates, including mandatory group tests and at-home rapid antigen tests. The recent outbreak is putting the city's healthcare system under pressure, forcing the government to take action. And from just a handful of infections in early May, monkeypox has escalated into a global public health emergency. There are now more than 45,000 cases scattered across at least 100 countries, mostly in Europe and North America. Governments are rushing to vaccinate at-risk populations and secure supplies of antiviral treatments. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
I think Jay Powell said things that were indefensible.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
We think that's the next secular shift.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
Yes, it's about renewables.
It's a challenging dynamic.
This is a level of uncertainty that we haven't had to deal with.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live tonight with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
You do not get stronger that moment that you're lifting the barbell. You get stronger as your body is making repairs, making recovery. Recovery is a when and how you get fitter, faster, stronger.
Recovery technology includes everything from massage guns and foam rollers to compression boots, hyperbaric chambers, cryo chambers, infrared saunas, and even infrared pajamas. And athletes are partnering to become investors to take those products mainstream.
When you look at tech in sports right now, it's completely innovating the way training's going, completely changing the way recovery's going. I think sky's the limit as far as where it can go.
But while some of these products can feel amazing, it can be difficult to differentiate between what really helps the body and what just tricks the mind.
Every time you're chasing the latest, greatest, newest tool, you're probably chasing a mirage.
the Fed is so late that it's looking at two challenges. It's looking at putting the inflation genie back into the bottle, and it's looking at not creating too much damage to economic growth and inequality.
Mohammed El-Erin of Bloomberg Opinion and Queen's College, Cambridge. I have to say, I wish Mohammed was here. I really wish Mohammed was here because he was absolutely scathing of this Federal Reserve yesterday. Let me quote him for you. This Fed has unfortunately failed an analysis, failed at forecast, and failed at communication. I imagine if Chairman Powell, if you're awake this morning, good morning. Tom, I wonder what he thinks of that.
There's a lot of it going on. I think Marcus Ashworth at Bloomberg said the same thing, but this is a crowded field right now of people looking back 18 months saying, say what?
So Marcus Ashworth said a couple of days ago on Bloomberg Opinion, this should be dedicated to one grand mea culpa for this central bank.
What I find interesting is we're going to be speaking to Bill Dudley later today. And how is he received here after his scathing questions?
I saw him yesterday with Tom, and he had this little hiking outfit on. I didn't recognize
that's what they do here, John.
this little hat.
People with real lives here actually go hiking.
I didn't recognize
What's amazing is people here, Maya, we got to do this. It's very important. Brad, if you could bring up the important photo we have of their selected people here that are not hiking, they're canoeing.
Oh, no.
And they can be out on the water. And it is extraordinary what happens when they canoe on the water. It's a beautiful image. We'll try to bring that to you later. It's it's coming. Thank you. Thank you. There we go. Look at that. Maya McGinnis wishing she was in the stern of the Grumman 18-footer as Lisa takes it on. What was it like? Lisa, very quickly, what was the water like? Seriously.
It was 68 degrees. If I had a bathing suit, I would have jumped in. It looked amazing. It was gorgeous.
There we go. Your canoe report here from Jackson Hole. We turn now to something that is a surprise. It's not about monetary theory or monetary policy. It is about fiscal policy. And Maya McGinnis is truly expert, and I mean expert at the study of America's fiscal mess. To say she's president of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget barely describes decades of a commitment that we've seen her. Maya, thank you so much for joining us in the frigid morning here. Our budget is on fire. It's always been on fire, but now there's something new. We're coming out of a pandemic with massive fiscal challenges, and now we've got to bolt on the student loan debate. Do you agree the student loan debate is problematic?
Yeah, I think, first, whenever I come to Jackson Hole, I feel like I'm coming from fiscal policy world bringing apologies. Like, sorry, we're making the job worse. We're making it so much harder. We had excess stimulus, which contributed to inflation. But now, what's remarkable, and the student loan forgiveness policy, I think, is absolutely the worst example of it, is that despite the fact that we're in an inflationary moment, where what we need to be doing is taking stimulus out of the economy, we have just, or the president has just, basically single-handedly added $500 billion more into the economy. That is clearly pushing in the wrong direction in inflation.
So important here, and you are our best guest of the morning, our second best guest of the morning, Jason Furman, says the same thing. Now, there's great overlap of what McGinnis and Furman are doing and many others, but everybody's on the same page. How did this get passed? How do we have this fiscal moment if people like McGinnis and Furman say no?
Well, and let me just remind you that just about a week and a half ago, the fiscal moment we were having is they had just, after a year of really difficult negotiation, passed the IRA, which was actually going to be deficit reduction. And it wasn't going to be a game changer for inflation, but it was going to move in the right direction on inflation. It was a huge pivot from a budget buster into something that was fiscally responsible. And basically, the ink is not dry on that, and the president is undoing this. And I think who can explain motivation? It's not good policy. This is a policy that's actually going to push up the cost of higher ed rather than bring it down because of the one-time nature and the expectations. It's political. This is not good policy, unfortunately.
Moving beyond this particular policy and to the potential downturn that a lot of people are expecting, people are going to wonder where is the space for some sort of additional fiscal stimulus given what we saw during the pandemic. How much do you look at the other side of the balance sheet, the record tax revenues that the U.S. government actually received as a result of the accelerated economy on the heels of that stimulus?
Yeah, I mean, what you want to do is set yourself up so that you can work with the business cycle and do your fiscal policy the right way, meaning when we borrowed during COVID, other than the last bill that I think was excessive, it was absolutely the right thing to do. We needed to borrow $5 trillion to help get us out of there. As soon as the inflation hit, we needed to be changing the fiscal path we were on because right now we're in this tricky situation where we could be in recession very soon and we may need to borrow again. Right now, the best thing we can do is get a hold on inflation.
One thing that you do really well is you take a look at the reality of interest rates as the cost of borrowing for this country. How much does a potential 4% baseline overnight rate mean? What does that translate for the affordability of the U.S. debt profile?
Yeah, I mean, so we have so much debt right now that a 1% increase in the interest rates will add $2.7 trillion to your interest payments over the decade. $270 billion a year. So that is bigger than almost any policy we have. So we are now, because the debt load is so large, hypersensitive to increases in rates. And that was what a lot of people were warning about when so many people were saying, don't worry about the debt, it's not a problem. It's moments like this where you start to see the real cost of that. Interest payments already predicted to triple over the next decade.
I'm the ugly foreigner, I guess, as Tom would say, but I've lived in America a long time. I think I can ask this question. How does the president do this without congressional approval? How does that happen?
Good question. It's a great question. It's not clear that it's going to work. You're hearing, I think we'll continue to hear concerns about the legality of this for sure. He certainly doesn't have the support of all members of this party, of his party. Again, a lot of people, starting with Joe Manchin and others, worked really hard to turn something that would grow the debt into something that would bring the deficit down. And then to watch him undermine that, I think there's a lot of discontent, particularly with the moderates in the party, but also from people who care about the policies saying this was a one-off that's not fixing it. There's a real problem with the unaffordability of higher ed. This will make it worse, not better.
My goodness, great to catch up with you. Just wonderful. And as Tom says, the best guest this morning.
The best guest this morning.
Second best is Jason Furman. Hey, Tom, I think it's a really important question from an outsider looking into the whole system and trying to become familiar with all of this. How do you do something that big right before the midterm elections without congressional approval? That seems bizarre to me.
That's been in the debate right from the get-go, as Maya McGinnis mentions here. But what's important is what's in the back of everyone's mind is Lisa Abramowitz's really good question. And okay, we've had this gift of low interest rates, and something like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget have said that party will end someday. It has. Now what? And those are big numbers. $2.7 trillion is real.
And it might get worse, Lisa.
Yeah, and how does this really shape the conversation, not only when it comes to the budget, but then constrain the Fed from a political standpoint about holding rates at, say, 4% for 2 years, the Anhatzius call.
Do you think the policy dilemma gets worse, not better, in the coming months?
Oh, well, are you kidding me? What a layup question. Of course she thinks it's get worse.
Well, I just want to understand the thinking behind the opinion, TK.
Yeah, so it's going to become a lot more difficult because, as we saw yesterday, the data is conflicting. So they have to choose a narrative, they have to choose a side, and they're going to be pilloried on either side of it. And it's very difficult at a time when you also have this overhang of debt and, frankly, a government that wants to keep spending.
It gets trickier if unemployment starts climbing.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's raining.
I can hear that, yeah.
Can you hear that? It's
any more value add
it's
from you?
it's raining harder in Jack Pine.
Goodness me.
Can we get the surveillance umbrella from Maya McGinnis, please?
Futures negative 0.4% on the S&P from Jackson Hole this morning. Good morning. This is Bloomberg.
So is there more pressure when you're trying to win a basketball championship than when you're trying to please investors? Where's the greater pressure?
Oh, I think it's definitely trying to win a championship. It's hard because a lot of, like when you invest, and you know this, when you're investing, you can control a lot more things. When on a basketball court, you can't control whether somebody's going to make a shot. You've got to get lucky.
And what's the greater pleasure, making 5 times your money on a distressed debt investment or winning the NBA championship?
They're both fabulous. I wish I could do one each year. That would be great. But I think there's a great feeling in being right on an investment that you've done a tremendous amount of work and you've made money for your clients, which I think is great. I think winning a championship it's a very surreal feeling because there's a whole city or state that is actually behind you. We had 70,000 people at the finals, and we had them all outside. You had 17,000 in the stands, and then literally like 60,000 people outside. And when we won, like just the joy that you had brought to the city was phenomenal.
No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
There's a sense it'll get to 7% in the coming months. Do you see that coming true?
There was something of a grey zone battle between Taiwan and China.
Where are the job cuts to come from? We will not just cut and run.
With unmatched reach and resources from more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, your global business authority. In a $7 trillion industry, there's a lot of ground to cover.
Prepare for an economic hurricane.
We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, Monday on Bloomberg.
I worry that core inflation is going to prove more sticky than the Fed anticipates right now.
I do think the Fed is going to push back on all this chatter about pivots.
The Fed just can't wait to let inflation work itself out.
I think the Fed solution is slow the economy down. It's growing faster than can possibly be sustained long term.
We have to get interest rates higher to slow down demand and bring inflation back to our target.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Live from Jackson Hole, Wyoming this morning. Good morning for our audience worldwide on TV and radio. This is Bloomberg Surveillance alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Farrow. Coming up later this morning, Chairman Powell, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 8 a.m. local. TK, we've been waiting for this one for a number of weeks now.
The buildup is extraordinary. It feels like a Hollywood event, except there's real substance to it. I would emphasize, John, that at 8 a.m. Wyoming time and on to the half-hour speech roughly,
sure.
And then we'll have our analysis after it. The bottom line is there's got to be some substance to it, and I would look for 1 or 2 sentences that change the debate.
I'm not sure how Hollywood, a group of academics talking about monetary policy, is.
I think the anticipation of this internationally, and you showed a bond chart earlier. Sure. You showed the yields. The fact is the yield is moving.
And
that's
the yield
a fact.
on the 2 years very close to the highs of the year.
But the 10-year is 307.
Very close to 340 and a 10-year back through 3% in the last week.
How much is the Fed going to basically have to come out and be that much more aggressive because of how much the market has rallied? That is the pivotal question to me, that it almost doesn't even matter what the projections are. It matters that they say we are committed to 75 basis points. We are committed to a neutral rate of X, Y, and Z in order to get the markets to cooperate.
Do you think we're going to hear that?
No, but I think that they're going to try to get the market to cooperate, and I don't know how they're going to do it. That's what I'm wondering.
Well, that's the problem, though,
right.
Isn't it?
I mean, that's the issue.
I think the market is waiting for this big hawkish tirade from a chairman who's been conditioned by an abysmal speech 12 months ago, Tom, that turned out to just be, when you read that speech, and I read it a couple of times in the last few days.
Yes, that's true. This is true.
That speech from 12 months ago, I do wonder how much this chairman has been conditioned by that whole transitory, temporary thing that, let's be honest, it didn't work out.
I'm less harsh than you are on this, but you are correct when you read the speech now in hindsight. It's painful. What I've learned here in the debate in the lobby, right behind our cameras, folks, is the gorgeous lobby looking out on the Grand Tetons. We showed them to you tonight, right now, but it's a little dark. But, John, with that, in that lobby, is an extension of the timeline. We have heard from Jan Hatzius on monetary policy and Sir Howard Davies on fiscal policy, the same message. It's going to take a longer time.
Raise and hold. Raise and hold. And Lisa framed it correctly. Raise to what and hold for how long? And we've got to ask them right now, what's the biggest mistake? What is the biggest mistake? Doing too much or doing too little?
And this really goes down to the question of where is inflation going to stop out at? And this is sort of the structural issue of, are we going to see a higher inflation and higher nominal rates for a much longer time? This is the PIMCO view. This is what Jan Hatzius is talking about, very much pushed back against by Stephen Major, who says we're going right back to where we were.
When does the sun come up?
I was actually looking at the weather before.
I think it comes up
We're on the
later
fucking
because we're
Weather
at
Channel.
6,000 feet.
Is that actually true?
Yes, of course.
Come on, you're ridiculous. Let's get to the market. Equity futures down 0.4. There's so many people out there that wonder with Tom whether something is true or not. Anyway, futures down 4 cents at 1% on the S&P 500. Your Kansas City
I'm
Fed
gonna have a beverage
application is in the trash, let me tell you.
We've proven today that Tang does not freeze in 6 degrees centigrade weather.
You can heat
Yields up 5 basis points, just short of 3.1% here, Lisa. Euro dollar north of parity, up a third of 1%. That's a stronger euro.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily on the heels of any expectation for ECB policy, which is important given the fact that it's sort of a question of what they can do. All right, today, obviously, we're watching the Fed speak that we hear out of Jackson Hole, leading up to that 10 a.m. Eastern speech, 8 a.m. local of Jay Powell. Before that, we're going to speak to Patrick Harker, Jim Bullard, and Raphael Bostic on Bloomberg surveillance, and we're going to talk about some of their baseline assumptions, where they could see raising rates to, and how long they could see holding them. At 8:30 a.m., we get a really interesting data. U.S. personal spending, personal income, core PCE deflator for the month of July. We're looking for the core PCE, right, and how much this is actually coming down and to what, but also personal spending. How much are people still spending? And then how are they feeling? 10 a.m. Eastern time, we get the University of Michigan sentiment survey for August. And remember when we used to care about this? I mean, which data point are we watching?
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago, this was a really important data point. It was University of Michigan Friday. And now it's a side note in a day dominated by a lot of other discussions.
Can you bring back, Qantas in New York, the picture of the 3 Fed presidents we are going to speak to? John, very quickly here. This is the heart of 1907 and 1912. They didn't trust Washington. They didn't trust New York. We needed regional presidents. And these 3 voices, John, are all uniquely different. Other than the fact they all want to not talk to us.
Front load is what we're going to hear from Jim Bullard. And you know we are. Patrick Harker said something interesting the last couple of days. He talked about 50 to 75 basis point rate hikes, and just since the early 80s, how rare that is.
Yeah.
And that even if it's 50 in September, in the grand scheme of things, in the last few decades, 50 basis points is a real rate hike for this Fed.
So how are they going to try to position even a 50 basis point rate hike as hawkish when the rest of the world will view this as dovish because of the expectations of 75 basis points?
That's the problem.
John, compare this to the Bank of England. The strength of the American system is invented in 1912 and reaffirmed in 1951 is those 3 guys we're going to talk to. They're all radically different in radical walks of life. Is it the same at the Bank of England?
I think historically that's been true over on the MPC. Yeah. We've had characters like Adam Posen and Danny Blanchflower on the Bank of England. You've got Catherine Mann there. Now Catherine Mann surprised me, Tom. I didn't expect her to be as hawkish as she has been at times, looking for a bigger move than others have. Saunders, who's left, I know now, over at the Bank of England, but Michael Saunders as well has turned out to be a pretty hawkish voice too. We've got a range of opinions at the Bank of England, just like we have at the Federal Reserve. I wish we had less groupthink, not more. I wish we had less groupthink and more dissenting voices. Can you believe how little dissent we have had, given what this economy has looked like in the last 12 months?
I wonder if sometimes the unanimous votes are masking some of the dissent under the surface, and you're sort of hearing that in some of the regional reports that are coming out.
I can go with that. Out of respect for the board.
Correct.
I mean, this is real life, folks. We had 2 Fed presidents having lunch yesterday, and John Farrell put on a waiter outfit. It said, John from England.
Okay.
You were over there. You were over there trying to serve him.
I've got to squeeze this in. We're having lunch. Neil Kashkari and Raphael Bostic are sitting behind, so I'm trying to listen in. Michael McKee comes over, and Michael McKee just goes, "Hi, guys," and says hi to Neil and Raphael. I'm like, Mike, you're blowing my cover. And Megan Green shouts over. She's like, John, yeah, because you don't stick out here. There's Tom and I in suits.
Yeah, you blend.
Everyone else is in hiking gear. Okay, I need to get to the guests. Leslie Falconio of UBS joins us now. Leslie, we talked to Bob Michael of JP Morgan Asset Management a number of days ago, and he talked about the trouble that you could have in high yield credit through the next 12 months. Do you share those concerns?
Yeah, we do. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, right now, fundamentally, high yield is strong. They have, a lot of cash on their balance sheet. Interest coverage is fine. Leverage has come down. But, going forward, given where spreads are and given the amount of contraction that we've seen, we definitely think that there could be trouble ahead. You can see this in the senior loan officer survey, which obviously has continuously contracted. And if, in fact, there is this barrier to entry in terms of credit, not to mention we have supply down 70% year over year, then there could be cautious ahead. I mean, right now we remain neutral on high yield because we don't want to short that carry, but you definitely have to watch it over the next year or so.
Leslie, describe curve inversion right now. We had the shock to 50 basis points of inversion. We've come back a little bit. Take full faith in credit curve inversion and bring it over to the plan for taxable fixed income in the next 6 months.
Well, I mean, this has been the interesting phenomenon when you think about the curve inversion. I mean, we went down to negative 58 2/10 back the morning of the CPI. And to your point, we have steepened out. But I think that, right now you have this push-pull of what the Fed potential could be in terms of raising interest rates, and the fact that the long end of the curve is saying, you might be able to bring inflation down if you're aggressive enough, growth will slow. Not to mention, when you look at things like the term premium in the 10-year area, although it's less negative than it was, it's still negative. And partly that has to do with really what's happening globally, whether it's in Europe or China. So you have this inversion of the yield curve, which frankly, we don't think is going to go away anytime soon. And by the way, its real yields were inverted as well.
I looked, Leslie, at this bond market, and they're supposed to react off the speech. To borrow a phrase from John Farrow, what if it's a nothing burger? What if nothing happens in the speech? Then what?
Well, listen, I think the market's really gone back to this June playbook. If you look at really what's happened in terms of the projection, we've gone from pricing in July close to 80 basis points of easing in 2023, now down to 35 basis points in 2023, and not in February, but in the latter part of the year. We've moved sort of the March peak to that 3.8% Fed funds rate, which is really not far right now from the Fed terminal. So you've kind of gone back to this June playbook, and a lot of Powell's constituents and their hawkish rhetoric has somewhat erased what he said in July's FOMC, that we're currently at neutral. So I think the market has really priced in or taken out a lot of that pivot and gone back to that June playbook in terms of forward pricing. If it's a nothing event, I mean, I think that you'll have that knee-jerk reaction with yields coming down and spreads tightening, just because people are concerned right now that he might lean more on the hawkish side.
Leslie, we've got to leave it there. Thank you. Leslie Falcone there of UBS. What are you doing this morning? What are you looking at? What's making you laugh?
What's making me laugh? 6 degrees centigrade. I mean, 6 degrees centigrade. I look at this and I think this came up. I'm going to give credit to Zero Hedge, but I really don't know who to give credit to. What if it's a nothing burger? Seriously.
Oh, I heard that from Luke Hickmore of Aberdeen.
Okay.
Last Friday, said the same thing. Could just well be boring. Could well be boring. Maybe it's one of these big historical things looking back over decades. You're not buying it at all, are you?
Two things. I hate the phrase nothing burger. I very strongly feel about this.
Okay,
Why is it a burger? I'm not a fan.
Imagine how disappointing a burger is if there's nothing
in there.
In it.
No.
Do you get it?
I'm devastated. I now understand the feeling. But
You're
I also think
for lunch. You haven't eaten for a while.
But honestly,
like nothing.
I think that they have to respond to some of the big debates, and if they don't, then that will be an issue for them to be tradable as well.
Let me inform you. Pharaoh's got secret microphones on Kashkari and Bostic, and I'm having a portobello nothing burger. What is a portobello?
Actually,
a mushroom burger? Are you kidding me?
Actually, we were talking about college football in the South. That's what we talked about. We had a discussion, and I've got to get to a Bama game this year. That's the discussion we had.
It could be our next remote. It'll be warmer than this.
And Raphael said we need to go and watch Atlanta play football, actual football.
American
with the round ball. With the round ball. Yeah, that. Futures down full tense. This is.
You look very natty this morning.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Ruchika Gupta. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is reinforcing his call for Russian troops to withdraw from Europe's biggest nuclear power plant after damage to transmission lines in the occupied territory disrupted power supply. The president says Ukraine is trying to prevent a nuclear accident that could impact all of Europe. The plant was captured in March when Russian troops swept through southern Ukraine. The average UK household will pay almost triple the price to heat their home this winter compared with a year ago. That's after industry regulator Ofgem raised the energy price cap on the back of soaring gas prices and is expected to increase it even more in January as the UK competes with other nations for limited gas supplies. It's a jarring increase for millions already struggling to afford everyday essentials. And California is the first government in the world to effectively ban gas-powered vehicle sales by 2035. The California Air Resources Board voted unanimously to adopt a plan that mandates 100% zero-emission and hybrid plug-in vehicle sales. The rule will likely also be adopted by 15 other states currently signed into California's existing zero-emission vehicle program. Work to implement the rule will begin in 2023. Global News, 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ruchika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Apple has identified its next big business, bringing advertisements to more parts of your iPhone. Today, Apple pushes ads in 3 places: the App Store, Apple News, and the Stocks app. In the News and Stocks apps, Apple shows display advertisements. That means that third-party companies like car dealerships or mortgage lenders can showcase their advertisements just like they can on a website. On the App Store, the situation is different. There, Apple has search ads. This allows developers to buy their way into showing up higher on search results. For instance, an App Store developer can bid for the term car racing or basketball so their apps would surface above competing apps in the list of results. Apple's push into ads is a little ironic, given that its ATT, or App Tracking Transparency Privacy feature, limits the ability for Meta, Snap, and even smaller developers to generate as much revenue as possible from advertising. That's because the feature allows users to choose if they want their data collected and tracked across third-party apps and websites. Still, Apple's hoping to expand its own ads business and is planning to add search ads to its Maps app. Other areas where ads could eventually appear are in Apple Books and Apple Podcasts, along, maybe one day, with an ad-supported tier of Apple TV Plus to compete with new offerings from Netflix and other streaming video providers. I'm Mark Gurman. This is Power On.
The difference between political gossip and policy intelligence. Bloomberg Government provides our clients with expert reporting, analysis, and public affairs tools that give you the edge in reaching policymakers on the Hill. When you're in the business of influence in Washington, information and connections are the currencies on which you rely. For knowledge you can act upon, the difference is Bloomberg Government.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
I was waiting for a little bit of sound there and it never came.
That was the silence.
I thought we'd hit.
That was the silence before the Grizz attack.
I thought we'd hear from the President of the United States, but we didn't. Maybe we can hear from the President a little bit later. From Jackson Hole, Wyoming this morning, good morning with Tom Keane and Lisa Bramwitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. Futures right now down about 0.4% on the S&P 500. You all know the times in the main event. It's 10 a.m. Eastern time. It's 8 a.m. local in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, when we'll hear from the Fed Chair, Jay Powell, TK, a little bit later this morning.
And to be clear, and I'm not making this as a joke, there's no press conference, there's no play with the media to the chairman afterwards.
No, as I understand it, Tom, it's a straight speech, could last somewhere up to about 30 minutes, Lisa, and then we go on from there.
We have to reiterate this. This is the first time in the history of this event held at Jackson Hole that we're being allowed inside the room as the public in a live streaming of this speech. 1982 is when they first started coming to the Jackson Hole, to this Jackson Lake Lodge. This is going to be the first time they are trying to address the public. How does that change the nature of the speech and why it's being done right now?
TK, I think it's very important that we hear from the chairman.
Well, it's timely, and it's timely for the data. Before we get to Emily Wilkins, let's review the data flow that we have coming in after Labor Day. John, Labor Day, I know you and I were focused on the Friday of the 2nd of September. Labor Day is after that, where America takes off.
So we're going to get payrolls, I believe, on September 2nd. And
Friday.
then we've got CPI on, I believe, September 13th.
Yeah.
We'll have some ISM in between and all that good stuff. But ultimately, they're the two big prints going into that September decision.
Then that's the economics, finance, investment of it. And then there's the politics. Emily Wilkins with Bloomberg Government in Washington joins us this morning. Emily, how does the dialogue change of the midterms given Friday the 2nd and particularly that Tuesday after Labor Day? What changes?
Well, I think the really big thing to watch, of course, is that Tuesday after Labor Day. I mean, inflation numbers, it's something that's on the minds of Americans. When I talk to lawmakers who are out there campaigning already, they say that they hear about that a lot. And even though the Biden administration has continually tried to point to low unemployment numbers and saying, look how great the economy is, Americans aren't necessarily buying that, and Republicans know that. They've really dug in on the issue of inflation as their main messaging point in the months before. Now, of course, Democrats breathed that sigh of relief in July to see those inflation numbers be a little flat. So we'll have to see what August brings. We'll have to see what those numbers are on September 13th, because that could really throw a bit of a grenade into the Republicans' argument should inflation start going back down.
All right. What is the quality of the polling now? Do we really know where these races stand? Do we get a better look at that in September?
Tom, that is such a good question. Remember, the polling for the last couple elections has not really been terribly accurate. Last year in 2020, it looked like Democrats were on track to do a lot of wins down ballot. I mean, sure, Biden won, but if you look at members of Congress, Republicans had a really great election, and the polls didn't reflect that. And so there's sort of been a mix in trying to figure out exactly what polling needs to do. There are lots of questions. I mean, take that New York special election that just happened, that big bellwether. That one, Democrats' own polling showed that their candidate was behind, and yet Pat Ryan wound up winning that night. So I think there are a lot of questions about when it comes to polling, exactly how accurate it's going to be. At the same point, I think there are only so many ways that you can measure an election and how well folks are doing, and polling's still a tool that we're going to use here in Washington.
Emily, we were speaking with Maya McGinnis just earlier from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, and she was talking about whether or not this student loan relief is going to actually get through in terms of the legal challenges. Can the president, John asked a really good question, can the president do this unilaterally, and if so, how? How likely is it that this actually becomes law given some of the legal challenges?
Well, I think we can definitely expect legal challenges on this one. The Biden administration has argued that there is a precedent in the past of allowing some sort of degree of student loan forgiveness and debt cancellation in cases of emergencies. This one, of course, is COVID-19. That's what they're pegging it to. Now, of course, there are lots of questions about exactly how much that's really impacted people's ability to pay. I mean, on one hand, the Biden administration is touting really low unemployment. On the other hand, they're saying that they need to forgive student loans because folks don't have the ability to pay them and delaying those payments. So it will be interesting, certainly something to watch, as this goes through the courts. But I think at this point, it's going to be interesting to see the timing on that, because certainly folks are going to be able to start applying for forgiveness and receiving that forgiveness before we really see things going through the courts. Remember, that takes some time. So it will be interesting to watch the play between that.
But I ask this because it's incredibly controversial, and we're going to be speaking with a whole host of people who are pushing back against this, and we have spoken to people who are saying, including Jason Furman, formerly of the Clinton administration, who say that this is adding to inflationary pressures at exactly the wrong time. How much does that actually impede the political debate versus just the economic one that we're having here?
That's a really great question, Lisa. I mean, the fact of the matter is that I think you are hearing from some economists who say it is going to increase inflationary pressures, Jason Furman, Larry Summers, but you have also heard from other economists who've argued against it. I think really right now what the Biden administration is looking at is a purely political calculation. This is a play for young voters. This is a play for progressive voters. This is a way for him to say, hey, I did keep my campaign promise on that. Inflation is already an issue for Democrats. Of course, the worse it gets, the worse it looks. I think it'll be really interesting to see exactly what happens with this, but expect this decision to continue to be controversial. And if it does wind up raising inflation, expect Republicans to absolutely pounce on that, the way that they've pounced on other legislation and spending that Democrats have passed, and tying that to inflation that we've seen.
Emily Wilkins down in DC of Bloomberg Government. Emily, thank you. It's the number one question I think we've all asked through the year so far. Is the calendar on the side of this White House? Is the calendar on the side of this White House? Because if the midterms were in February, in March and April, Tom, I think we'd be talking about a very, very different result to the one we're potentially talking about right now.
There have been a lot of times in American history where that questions had to be studied, asked, and, over the years really analyzed over a given outcome. So I think it's not uncommon to see that. But what I would say, the partition of inflation, which I don't think is the biggest topic.
What do you think is?
Crime. I think the abortion issue seems to have huge traction. See Kansas and see the important vote up the Hudson River as well. We haven't talked on this show enough about crime, and I'm uncertain if crime is resonating.
Lisa?
Well, the issues, I actually agree with Tom, because the parties are pretty pitted in terms of where they place the blame for inflation. So I think that the marginal issues, including education, are the ones that are very much going to drive that. That said, I do think that your question about his timing on their side is a good one. How much are they manipulating the timing? And I say this not necessarily in a pejorative way, but with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, that release with 72 straight days of gasoline declines, how much is that really shaping the debate?
It's not just me, it's getting colder, right?
Yeah, it is actually.
Yeah, there's a breeze coming off Jackson Lake.
I have to ask the question, why did news anchors stand in the rain, the cold? What's it about?
I think people enjoy.
You think
what's amazing, John, seriously, the wind has come up here at 6 degrees centigrade, but it's more accentuated because Jackson Lake is at high tide. It's at high tide.
You're killing me this morning.
Okay.
As you often do.
No, it's at high tide and you get a little more wind.
Adam Posen's going to join us very shortly. Futures are down 4/10. This is Bloomberg.
make it very transparent to the shopper before they accept an order, what the order is going to look like, how much we're going to pay them, and how much like the consumer is paying them. And so they can decide whether they take an order or whether they refuse it. And that's the kind of flexibility that our shoppers really value and the kind of transparency that they want.
Are you seeing a labor shortage right now? And what are you doing to combat that?
It's different in different places. Our demographic of shoppers is completely different from food delivery and ride sharing. We're 70% women and half of them are moms. And that's because a lot of the job at Instacart is very different than just being in a car with strangers. It's about like going to the store, doing a good job of customer service, of really picking the right products for the consumer. And we are seeing that being very appealing to women.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
I'm going to take a look right here at regulation.
We are seeing digital currencies under some pressure.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto. The people.
I want to have some of my money outside of the sovereign.
The transactions.
It all comes down to the details here.
And the technology.
How does that affect disruptors like you?
What happens to everything that you're investing in when the last Bitcoin is mined?
Bloomberg Crypto, Tuesdays.
Live from Jackson Hole this morning. Good morning. Here's the price action this Friday morning. Going into Chairman Powell a little bit later. Equity futures negative on the S&P 500. Down on the session. Down on the week. We're down by about 0.4% on the S&P. Similar move on the Nasdaq 100. Down about 0.5%. If you tee up the bond market, you'll notice the 2-year very close to 340 through much of this week. Right now, 337. Yields basically unchanged at the front end. Higher at the longer end by 4 basis points.
10 years talking to me.
10-year 3.07%. What's the 10-year telling you, Tom?
It's telling us $2.99 a cup of coffee ago.
Love that. The bond market's speaking to me.
The bond market's speaking to me before this speech. I'm sorry, it is.
Can I tell you that I felt freezing cold a moment ago? Then Adam Posen came to the set, and now I just feel like, you know, look how weak we look now with Adam Posen.
Central bankers got to show toughness.
Yeah, there we go.
Is that the theme for this Jackson Hole?
And joining us now, as you know, there are Northeasters off the shores of New England, and when you were a child and the wind comes off Kenmore Square and moves up to Coolidge Corner, you can tough out the cold like young Posen did in Brookline, Massachusetts years ago. What in God's name are you doing? What happened? Is your luggage in Denver?
My luggage is this big, so there was no room for a coat. But anyway, nice to see you.
Are we going to get a chill from Chairman Powell today?
No, Chairman Powell's going to take you into his warming embrace of central bank credibility.
He's going to do it. This is an important conversation. We're making jokes, folks, but this is the most important conversation of the day. Don't tell Jason Furman. Sir Howard Davies was just on, confirming Olivier Blanchard and Stiglitz's work on 4% inflation courageously in 08-09. You have led the charge globally in support of Olivier. You go to a 3% number. When are we going to escape from the 2% fortress, the box that we're in at 2%?
In my view, Tom, we have the opportunity for opportunistically doing that on the ends of this cycle. That the central bank, the Fed, also ECB, Bank of England, but they won't do it, are going to be coming down. They're going to knock down inflation. It's going to be painful, but they're going to get it down. A year from now, inflation's going to be well under 5, you know, and then it's going to be how much do you grind down the economy further to get to 2. And if they're smart and they do the right thing, at that point, your 10-year is going to be back down, and they just very slowly let it come down from there, not push to 2.
The denominator of the calculus is time. Jan Hatzius at Goldman Sachs says the solution is to extend out to a longer duration. Sir Howard Davies says fiscally it will be a longer duration. Can we be comfortable at opposing 3% inflation, knowing that it will extend out and give us more stability?
Yes. I mean, nothing's guaranteed, but we can be comfortable this is the right bet. Because in the end, if the central bank, if particularly the Fed, goes up to 4% plus on the short end, and does whatever it takes to get inflation from 8.9 to something starting with a 4 and going down, there won't be any credibility issues. It's going to be back to normal. It may not be back to the golden age. It's going to be back to normal. But Tom, the big issue is what happens next. If we're in a world of repeated supply shocks, negative supply shocks, rising energy prices, shortages, in part because of deglobalization, then the question comes, is the inflation target the right way to go?
What do you think is the right way to go in that world?
I've been trying to work on it, Jonathan, and I know that others are starting to think about it, but I don't have any sense that the central banks are grappling with it right now, partly because they got something else to worry about, and partly because they all feel, oh, we did a strategic review and we got burned. But you have to start thinking about this. If we're going to be in a world where, due to climate change, due to geopolitical conflict, due to self-reliance of everybody trying to look after themselves, be it energy, food, vaccines, then you got a world with a lot more frequency of negative supply shocks. You got a world of stuff trending up. So maybe you change the definition of the target. Maybe you do more fiscal monetary coordination. Maybe you change your forecast communications, that you try to section that off. I think one way to go, and this may be something Sir Howard talked about, is you want to think about a fiscal monetary combination to deal with climate change specifically. You issue green bonds, the central bank does QE in green bonds, and you just sort of separate that out and separate out what should be trend rising energy prices.
I'm hearing the end of central bank independence in a bit of that. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't think it's fair. I think it's a risk because the thing, and you and I, well, Tom and I, you guys are too young. Back in the global financial crisis in 2011, 2012.
I was around for that.
Really? Well, for that, you may recall, I was out there saying to our friends at the ECB, don't be a teenager. A teenager thinks independence is you just say no to anytime anybody asks you to do something.
Really?
Independence is you go out and you say, I'll do something if I think it's in my interest. Central bank can coordinate, it just has to not be forced to do it.
You started the conversation by saying that we're going to hear the warm embrace of central bank credibility. I don't understand that, because what does it mean to have a warm embrace at a time when they want to fight against what the markets are doing?
Yeah, I think Lisa, I was being a bit facetious here as I shiver, but I think the reality is the markets, if you listen to what you all just said about the yield curve, broadly have it right, okay? They broadly have it right that the curve is inverting, the short end's higher than the long end, the short end is not, seems high, but isn't that ridiculously high. We're not talking Volcker, we're not talking EM high. And we think that we're getting to, roughly 4% in my view by February. Now, the market keeps saying a lot of stuff, trading a lot of stuff, financial conditions, depending how you measure it, goes back and forth. And I know you talk about this. I saw you out here yesterday. But the fact is that's not something for the central bank to micromanage. Let the market figure out that the Fed is on this path. The less Chair Powell says, and just says to some degree a mea culpa compared to last year's Jackson Hole speech, and says we're on this path, the better.
Well, but one of the big questions is not only the balance sheet, but also the protracted inflation. What are we looking at longer term? And you're saying we could hold it at 3%, right? Do we hear that out of the Fed during this meeting? Is that something? So then how do they address how much higher inflation could be over the longer term due to deglobalization and some of these other commodities-related factors?
I think we have to. I'm not on the program this year. I'm just a participant. But if I had a word into the next president after Esther George of Kansas City Fed, I'd say that should be next year's topic, which is a world of, instead of this discussion of constraints, which is this year's topic, talk about shocks. Talk about a world of much more frequent, much more one-sided shocks. Talk about a world where these kinds of deglobalization shocks matter. I'm actually going to be speaking at a Fed Dallas conference about this in a couple months. Anyway, we have to get ahead of that, but it's obvious for political reasons, in a good political sense. The Fed can't go around talking, well, conceptually, just look through this, and in a few years, we'll be worried about that. Can't do that.
Bob McTeer of the Dallas Fed didn't talk as much as the present Fed president.
Yes.
Is there too much communication?
Yes. Full stop.
How do we do this? Does Powell just say, enough, let's cut it in half?
If he could, he would have by now. I think
who's the police that tells
there
them
is
to
no
put a cork in the mouth?
There is no
Wait,
police.
you said that to me this morning.
Every day.
Every day.
And look how well it works.
It works. Yeah, great.
I was considered a loudmouth when I was at the Bank of England a decade ago.
I thought that was Danny. I thought that was Danny, Adam. I didn't know that was you.
But if you actually look at the frequency of the conversations I had, and the speeches and the TV appearances, it was between a third and a half of what your average Federal Reserve Bank president does now.
So then why, if Fed Chair Jay Powell does think that there's too much communication, why broadcast this address for the first time in this history of the event here at the Jackson Lake Lodge?
I think there are two reasons. The first is, Lisa, there is sort of a ratchet effect on communications. In the world we're in, with you all, with Twitter, which has kicked me off for unfair reasons and hasn't put me back yet, with all that world, there's always people bubbling up and saying, oh my God, why aren't you talking? Why are you behind closed doors? And so every time you move more into transparency, it's a ratchet effect. You can't move back.
I'd be the first to say it.
And
what are they doing? Why are they talking so much?
Well, no, they are talking too much, but also just to distinguish, the chair talking isn't too much. It's the other people talking.
It's the regional Fed presidents, and to your point, I'm not sure what they can do about that.
No, I think, to be honest, I don't talk to Chair Powell about this. Don't get me. I'm not channeling him. But if you go back, it's very clear. Chair Bernanke, Chair Yellen, Chair Powell have all been frustrated by this. And at the moment, it's less harmful because the entire FOMC is basically singing from the same song sheet. You have Mary Daly and Kashkari, out there talking quite hawkish.
Yeah.
Nobody's undercutting the message, so it's less bad than it usually is. But yeah, it would be better if they stopped.
It just popped into my head. And for those of you on radio, this is critical. Dr. Posen looks like one of the show managers for an act at Glastonbury. He's got the flip-flops
That's what you think?
And the shirt. And
Can I also clarify on your behalf that you weren't thrown off Twitter because you did something wrong? You were hacked.
I was hacked, yes, thank you.
Just before people start making
That's very good of you, Jonathan.
Anytime.
Yes, I was hacked, and Twitter has not, despite my blue check, has not.
Well, if Twitter's out there and they're listening.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for giving me this
opportunity. Can I congratulate you for extending this hugely important debate of where we set from 2 to 3 to 4%? And Adam's leadership.
To Adam's point, though, they can't acknowledge that idea right now.
Absolutely.
It would be almost counterproductive to be discussing it in this very moment. It's something for the future.
But just the last thing on that, and thank you for the backing on the more important point as well as the Twitter point. The important thing is I don't want Chair Powell, whatever he says today, to overcommit, to feel he has to do too much, because then we're blocking off the future. In other words, I don't want him going out there and saying 2% means 2% today. If he does that, that's a mistake.
Can you be sure Dr. Posen gets one of our surveillance fleeces, please?
Are you saying that we kept one to the side for after the interview and not during it?
I thought you left them in Davos. Anyway, thank you.
Fantastic to see you.
Thank you
so much.
Adam Posen there. As we look ahead to that speech from Chairman Powell in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Again, if you're just tuning in, that's going to take place at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, Tom. 8 a.m. local.
It's going to be critical.
Futures down around about a third of 1% on the S&P 500 from Jackson Hole this morning. Good morning. This is Bloomberg.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Ritika Gupta. For the third time this month, a U.S. Congress member is visiting Taiwan. Tennessee Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn is on a 3-day trip to the island. That's likely to further test Washington's tense ties with Beijing. Earlier this month, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, prompting Beijing to fire missiles over the island for the first time. 2 weeks later, U.S. Senator Edward Markey led a bipartisan delegation to Taipei. Hong Kong is reinstating some of its COVID-19 curbs beginning Sunday as cases soar in the city. The government will increase testing rates, including mandatory group tests and at-home rapid antigen tests. The recent outbreak is putting the city's healthcare system under pressure, forcing the government to take action. And Blackstone is the latest institutional investor to back away from an overheated housing market. Home Partners of America, the single-family landlord owned by Blackstone, says it will stop buying homes in 38 cities starting next month. The company says home price growth, market demand, and increasing regulations as factors in its decision. Home Partners operates in more than 80 markets. T-Mobile is teaming up with Elon Musk's SpaceX to offer wireless phone service in remote parts of the U.S. where coverage is spotty. Musk and T-Mobile CEO Mike Sievert announced the partnership at SpaceX's Starbase in Texas. Musk says the satellite-based service will work even during hurricanes and natural disasters that knock out those traditional cell phone towers, and that it will ultimately save lives. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ruchika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
China's appetite for energy is enormous. The country consumes about a quarter of the world's energy supply, 35% more than the US annually. Its energy needs have more than tripled since the year 2000. That consumption has helped to fuel astonishing growth, but it's come at a cost.
China is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. There is no way to tackle climate change unless China reduces its emissions to net zero.
The country's reliance on fossil fuels is also a hindrance to its own growth and the well-being of its citizens.
China is not energy secure. It has a massive import bill for things like oil and gas. It has a long-standing pollution problem, and it is also prone to outages that severely hamper industry.
All this has led the world's biggest polluter to take steps towards a radical transformation.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
A $7 trillion industry, there's a lot of ground to cover.
Prepare for an economic hurricane.
We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, Monday on Bloomberg.
We always talked about the least, what's the least worst risk. That would be slightly higher inflation at the end of this pandemic period rather than deflation. And that's where we're at now. Our core inflation, 4 to 6%. We believe we are largely at the peak of it now. And we will fight it back into 1 to 3.
Adrian Orr there, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand governor from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Governor Bailey doing the rounds as well, Tom. Haven't seen him yet.
I haven't seen him, but an important attendance today. And I guess they'll do the photo thing, like the Queen? Like you and the three of us could do it.
Like
we
that?
Could go out there.
He wants
Lisa
us to
could
do
wave
it.
to the elk.
Yeah.
And all that. We need to give you a weather report here. We're down 4 or 5 degrees here from when we started our broadcast this morning to help John
Like
Farrow.
I said, we need to give you a weather report.
That's my favorite part, too.
We're at 3.889 degrees Celsius, which, just to help out.
Is that actually what the temperature is?
Yes.
That's
4 degrees Celsius.
That's ridiculous.
That's called Wyoming. We will continue here anticipating a speech. John, help me here. An hour and 10 minutes. Am I even close there on the
I don't believe you're anywhere
2
near.
hours?
It's more like 2 hours and 10 minutes.
We've got like 3 clocks here, folks. We've got
so the clock down here, Tom, allow me to introduce you to the set. This is the cameraman. That's the clock in Eastern time. Okay, that's in Eastern time. And at about 10 a.m. Eastern, you'll hear from the Chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Guys, we're still
We also stay on London time as well when we speak with Will Kennedy, Senior Executive Editor for Energy and Commodities at Bloomberg. Will, it is not funny in Europe now on energy prices. It is a moonshot to the sky, and we all know prices always break. How or what or when do these parabolic moves in Germany, France, and England, how and when do they break?
It's difficult to say. I'd start by saying that they continue to go skywards. We had an extraordinary price in French power this morning, above 1,000 euros a megawatt hour for the first time. And that's well over 10 times what it was a year ago. It's complete change, and it's several $100s a barrel. I mean, more than $500 a barrel in oil terms. It must break eventually because people can't afford to pay these prices. All over Europe, we're seeing people shut factories. Fertilizer plants, aluminium plants, zinc plants, they're starting to shut because people just won't pay these prices for electricity. So that's how it breaks. It breaks through demand destruction, and we're starting to see that process accelerate now.
Well, difficulties in the UK. Talk to me about this new cap in the United Kingdom on energy prices and the difficulty that the people of the UK are going to face this winter and perhaps even more so in the year to come.
Yep, every 6 months or 3 months, a maximum price that the average household will pay for electricity and gas is set. A year ago, that was about £1,200. Today, it's almost 3 times that, at more than £3,500, more than $4,000. Obviously, for the average household, that sees them pay a huge amount of their monthly disposable income in energy costs. It's going to be very hard for people, and it's going to have a huge knock-on effect for the rest of the economy, because every extra pound that's spent on power and gas is one less pound people are spending in pubs, supermarkets. So it's a huge problem for the next Prime Minister. It could accelerate inflation. We had an inflation forecast of up to 18% for later this winter in the UK from Citibank earlier this week. And so far, the political response has been very underwhelming. We don't know who's going to be Prime Minister the week after next, and both camps have not put forward any concrete proposals about what they might do to ameliorate this situation.
Well, right now we're empathizing deeply with what a Europe could feel like without heat in the wintertime, and it seems unsustainable, just anecdotally. I'm wondering whether there's a discussion about caps to usage of energy ahead of that time to try to store up more of the supplies. I mean, we heard about this in Germany, for example. How much is that still on the discussion table?
It's happening, and it's happening in 2 ways. It's happening through the market-based mechanism I described earlier, Lisa, that people are just not going to use as much electricity. And then there are policy proposals, whether that's people turning down their thermostats, towns putting on street lights for less time. And I think as we get deeper into winter, we're going to see from both sides, both conscious policy and market-driven responses, we're going to see more and more of those things. It's going to be a dark and difficult winter for many European countries. And politicians are going to have to start talking more about the sacrifices required. But politicians are also going to have to step up the policy response, I think, also in the UK.
Will Kennedy, my oil engineering textbooks said oil is a global price. I get it, there's a war, it's really, really serious. But if the global price is broken down, can the agony of Europe come across the Atlantic to parabolic prices in America?
Yeah, there's a huge arbitrage, energy arbitrage there, that the market can't close. In oil, you can close these arbitrages, and we're seeing that with record exports of oil and diesel out of the US and gasoline towards Europe. But you can't do that as easily for gas and power. As much gas as possible is being put on the water, but there just isn't the export capacity to close that arbitrage. So we will see higher gas prices in the US because of what's going on, but will they rise to meet European levels? It's actually impossible for that to happen. So to some extent there will be those linkages, but the linkages don't exist for gas and power in the same way that they do for oil.
Hey, well, thank you. Will Kennedy in London on the difficulties of European energy and what it means for the European consumer. We have to also talk about what it means for the central banker as well, as we look ahead to a central bank decision on September 8th from the ECB and President Lagarde, and the Bank of England for that matter as well. What does a rate hike achieve in this world?
Well, I mean, that's the issue, right? I mean, they can't do anything about the price of gas. They can't do anything about the supplies there or the conflict with Russia invading Ukraine. So at what point do they respond to this? And at what point can they take the long game? Can they take the Howard Davies approach and be gradual in how quickly they raise rates?
They don't have that luxury. As he said, he's out of service, and so he can talk and they have to act, which is very different. I was looking over Lisa's right shoulder, folks, the rock star rooms here at the Jackson Lodge with a beautiful view of the mountains are off over her shoulder, and I could see Chairman Powell's room, and there's 4 guys in the room, and they are in major rewrite right now.
Is that what they're doing?
They're in major rewrite.
Is that what they're doing?
Yeah,
Are you starting rumours?
I'm not starting rumors. I think they got to worry about every sentence of the speech. I'm not kidding. They got to worry. It's got to be a chiseled speech.
Do you think there will be some kind of reaction to the reaction we had from the last news conference?
Yes, in some way. Yes, there's got to be. He's got to address it.
touched on it. Perhaps the potential for a disconnect between what they're saying and what the market is pricing. I have to say, Adam Poston pushed back a little bit against that view.
He said that there really is not a disconnect, that the market's actually got it pretty much right. And this is something that we've heard from other people as well, that you're seeing it in the bond market with the inversion in the yield curve, and that perhaps in terms of what pain is required, equities are pricing that in.
I had one tweet moments ago. TK, just one question, John. Why has Colombo joined you today?
John, I can't.
Thank you for that one.
Camera 3 is John. Camera 3.
That's just getting me through the morning.
John, camera 3 is over here, and I'm frozen. I can't turn to it.
Why has Colombo joined us today? We don't know. We have no idea.
He was wandering around Jackson Hall.
It would be
Did Colombo do the weather often on that show?
I don't know. I never watched. It was a comedy show that ran through 2003. Look it up. It's Doppelganger.
I can't talk.
You can. Ed Giardini's coming up from the Giardini Research. We're looking forward to that, and we've got a host of Fed speakers for you in the 9 a.m. hour.
This
so
is
9
colder than Davos.
You know what, TK?
It actually is.
This is Bloomberg.
We anticipate that you will have regulations clarifying what the SEC is going to do on cryptocurrencies and related kinds of things in the near future.
It's pretty clear that many of these tokens may be securities. What we've asked the trading platforms, the lending platforms, the other various venues to come in, to work with us, to get registered under the securities laws, because if a platform has 50 or some of them 500 tokens on their platform, probabilities are they're not all non-securities.
Now, there's another issue that has arisen, which is called gamification. which is to say people are making a game out of trying to buy stocks. Are you worried about this phenomenon?
We live in the 2020s in a new digital age where applications on our phones can use massive amount of data and then predict our behavior. What do we do when the digital algorithms are maximizing for the company's revenues rather than our returns? And so we're trying to think that through. It's not just gamification, it's a little bit more than that. It's whether there's a conflict between the app and our investment returns.
A lot's happening on Wall Street.
I think Jay Powell said things that were indefensible.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights
We think that's the next secular shift.
from businesses most influential and instrumental.
Yes, it's about renewables.
It's a challenging dynamic.
This is a level of uncertainty that we haven't had to deal with.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live tonight with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio. However you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg. No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
There's a sense it'll get to 7% in the coming months. Do you see that coming true?
There was something of a gray zone battle between Taiwan and China.
Where are the job cuts to come from? We will not just cut and run.
With unmatched reach and resources from more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, your global business authority.
It's a momentous time in the economy with both significant uncertainty about inflation and recession.
We think they're going to hold the Fed funds rate constant.
It could be over 4%. I don't think that's out of the question.
They are trying to tighten financial conditions to slow the economy down, not just a little bit.
I know what they should do, which is they should not blink.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
I used to love Colombo. It's a great show, Tom.
You're still on this.
Clearly inspired. From Jackson Hole, Wyoming this morning. Good morning, good morning. For our audience worldwide on TV and radio, alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Farrow, counting you down to an address from the Fed Chairman Jay Powell, taking place a couple of hours from now, right here. And wow, does this Fed have a lot of work to do. Inflation TK 8.5%, and a speech 12 months ago from this chairman that failed to capture the moment.
That's clearly what's out there. I've seen it in every news source and of the people, the conversations here. Does he drop in a sentence or two, not of apology, but just to note that they got it wrong?
Marcus Ashworth of Bloomberg Opinion earlier this week saying just that, Lisa, that maybe we should have the grand mea culpa at an event like this one.
Okay, so let's say he does that, but then what are they transitioning to, right? I mean, now we're not getting forward guidance, even though we get a lot of discussions, and perhaps too much, as we were talking about earlier. But what does that mean in terms of the new regime that they're talking about if it's not the transitory? Where do you mea culpa to?
True, and you've been asking the question, what do we raise to? How long do we hold for? And raise and hold is a theme that we've heard repeatedly, I think, through the week already. A little bit later this morning, we'll have a range of Fed interviews. We'll be catching up with President Harker, President Bullard, President Bostic. President Bullard, front load, front load, front load. Is the market paying attention to that communication from certain Fed presidents anymore? Do you think it is?
You know, it moves sometimes on their speak, and particularly if they have been hawkish or dovish, then they shift their tone. How much has the front loading, though, been baked in? And this is something that you both have been pointing out. The front end of the yield curve is really what's been moving. And to Adam Posen's point, is this the market listening to what the Fed is saying and actually pricing it accurately rather than not listening and having to be job-owed into
more importantly,
coordination?
John, President Hollenhorst is going to join us after
President
this speech. Because I'm sorry, people like Andrew Hollenhorst at Citigroup, along with other worthies, have said, we have done the work, we have done the math, and this is a level they have to go to with Bloomberg economics, even above Hollenhorst, 4-ish up to, dare I say, 5-ish.
Andrew Hollenhorst over at Citi has Fed funds at 4% this year, at the end of this year, and he has another 75 basis point move in a September meeting. Lisa, you've mentioned it a few times already this week, and I think a lot of people will agree with you that this address today shouldn't just be about the September meeting.
Yeah.
An address today like this one, given that we're going to see it streamed for the first time as well at an event like this one, it's got to be about more than just one meeting.
Yeah.
It's got to be about the bigger picture.
The framework, what are we looking at in terms of the end goal of inflation? And, you know, Adam Posen said something at the very end, and it was off the cuff, but it was possibly the most important thing that he said, which is if this Fed chair comes out and just keeps saying, we're getting to 2%, we're going to get there as quickly as possible, that's going to be a really big deal for this market. How much, then, can they not necessarily say they're aiming for 3%, but still get that message across that perhaps they're not, you know, gung-ho?
Do you get the feeling that when they give a speech like this one, that they get onto the Bloomberg Anywhere afterwards and check where SPX is trading? Do you get a feeling that that's a feature of some of this?
That's a really good question, actually.
But if they do that, what do they want to see? What they don't want to see, we have thought, is the market rallying because that eases financial conditions. What are they trying for?
I would respect, to John's great question, they're looking at the Bloomberg Financial Conditions Index, which is what Gita Gopinath looks at the IMF. It's 11 ratios. Michael Rosenberg invented it. Fancy math, and it has not cooperated recently.
Do you know what I'd love? If Mike McKee, and I'm going to ask Mike to do this in the next news conference, would just tell the chairman where the Nasdaq was trading.
Oh, that's a great idea.
As the news conference was going on.
Great.
The last few press conferences we've had with this chairman, what's the Nasdaq been up? 3.5%.
They should just have like a little ticker that he puts on his desk that just shows the response in real time.
I always used to think that Draghi had euro dollar on
You
the
think
desk
so?
in his news conferences. I always thought that was what was happening. Tom.
What I just noticed here, and for those of you on Bloomberg Radio, before John brings in our wonderful guest, and John, I think this is really important. We're sort of moving around like the hockey bench at Yale University about 40 years ago, and the coldest rink in New England.
Just sort of rock back and forth.
We're all sitting here like we're on a hockey bench at Hamilton College, and you know the wind's coming off Lake Moraine, and it's like 10 above zero, and they're worried the puck is going to break in half.
Just back and
we're
forth.
all just going,
we're all just like this. Kind of, yeah.
It's like 39 degrees.
Ed Yardeni's in the room. Ed Yardeni joins us now from Yardeni Research. Ed, let's just start right here. The chairman speaks in about 2 hours from now. What would you like to hear from the chairman?
Well, I think he's going to repeat more or less what he said at the press conference at the end of July. This was less than a month ago, and I don't think there's going to be a radical change because what have we really learned from since then? We've learned that the labor market is very strong, and we've learned that maybe inflation is peaking, but it still remains way too high. So I think he's going to more or less say the same thing. And he did give us forward guidance back at the press conference. He said, look at the summary of economic projections. That's what the committee is thinking about the Fed funds rate, in which case he's talking about 3.25 to 3.5% on the Fed funds rate by the end of this year, and something like 3.75 to 4% by the end of next year.
Ed Yardeni for the Ute of Economics, Finance, and Investment. Let's go back to the days of C.J. Lawrence. Is this inflation like the inflation of Volcker or the inflation of the 70s?
Well, this is like that TV show, the 70s show on Fast Forward. You know, the 70s was a long decade that was basically called the Great Inflation. I think it basically started in 1965 and lasted until the early 1980s. This, I think, is really going to turn out to be more like what happened after the soldiers came back from World War II. And we had this huge demand for consumer durable goods. And Ford was making bombers, not cars. And it took them a couple of years to retool. I think a lot of this inflation has been consumer durable goods inflation. But it's different. I mean, it's not different. We really also have an energy component to it, and I think that could soon moderate. I think this is not going to be a great inflation of the 1970s. I think we have seen the peak. I think it is going to moderate, and I think we can all hopefully look forward to that.
Well, Ed, what do you think of the Adam Posen idea that we are going to have to tolerate a 3% inflation rate for a longer period of time, and the Fed has to essentially be more okay with that? How is that sort of shaping the view among academics in terms of what's acceptable versus what they're saying, which is still 2%?
Yeah, I've been thinking for a while that there's just no way they're going to get inflation down to 2% anytime soon, which means I don't think it's going to happen this year. I don't think it's going to happen next year, and maybe even not the year after that. The problem is, as we all know, rent inflation, and rent inflation is sticky, and we know that a lot of people are seeing their rents go up quite a bit, and they only show in the CPI, it only shows the total pool of rents. It doesn't show what's happening on the margin. So right now, rents are, depending on which measure you're using, basically going up 4 or 5% overall, but on the margin they're going up by 10 to 20%, and so that's going to be reflected over time. So I think they are going to have to change their tune here and conclude that maybe 3% is what inflation target they want to reach, or they'll do an inflation target excluding rent.
Ed, let's talk about this equity market and finish there. I quoted a piece from you a little bit earlier this week on what you had to say about the US dollar. It's something we haven't talked about much this morning, but it's something we've talked about a lot this week. The dollar's a whole lot stronger. What do you think that means for corporate profits in America? What are we underestimating, and what does it mean for where you want to be in this equity market, and ultimately what you want to avoid?
Well, by the way, first and foremost, I think a strong dollar is equivalent to at least a 50 basis point rate hike, and quantitative tightening is equivalent to at least that as well. So I think that actually lowers the terminal rate on the Fed funds rate. For corporate profits, we've already seen companies like Microsoft announce that the strong dollar is going to take something away from their profitability. And that'll happen to most of the multinational companies that get a significant part of their revenues from overseas.
Ed Yardeni, thank you, sir. Ed Yardeni of Yardeni Research. That point on the US dollar there, Lisa, you get a two-punch combo, a double hit, so to speak. You get the hit from the translation effect from Europe because you're going to have this much, much weaker currency back into US dollars. Then you've just got the weakness in the economy on top of that. So there's two layers to this. Yeah. It's pretty brutal.
Yeah, it's brutal. And how much is this also sort of exacerbated by the flight to safety? And how do you deal with the fact that there really is no other place other than the Swissy that people are going to?
Love the Swissy, don't you? Tom leans over to me in the interview and he just he blows whatever's in there and just goes, hot tang.
This is hot.
I know. I was trying to focus. I could hear it.
How did we get you focused and just dialed in for 3 hours?
It's hot tang and cloves, and I was like, you got to be kidding me. I've never had it. And it's really, really quite good.
A really interesting headline just crossed the Bloomberg. I know you picked up on it as well, Lisa. It came from the Czechs, calling for an urgent meeting of energy ministers on power prices.
You're going to see more of this.
You're going to see way more of this, Tom, in Europe. We keep going back to the same question. I know it sounds like a lot of doom and gloom, and it might sound overly dramatic to many people out there, but when you look at the price action in things like European nat gas, when you see what's happening with the utility bills in the UK and across Europe, I think it's fair to call it exactly that. And that's how European leaders are starting to treat it. Now, Tom, the point that we haven't discussed enough, and it's a dynamic we're going to hear more of as we come out of August into September and onwards toward winter, is the kind of things that need to be implemented by policymakers to pull back on consumption. We're going to see a lot more of that in different phases of it.
Where's there evidence that they can do that other than a war psychology, and the affluent West has not developed a war psychology?
Dare I say, Tom, they have the pandemic playbook to pull back on consumption.
Yeah, although you do wonder why policymakers in Europe haven't been more aggressive, given even energy companies coming out and saying, guys, you got to start conserving a little bit more.
The sun is rising in Jackson.
Are you going to sink?
You're not going to get
No, I'm not going to sink, but there's ice crystals around the moon.
Are you done? Futures down 1/3 of 1%. This is Bloomberg.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Ritika Gupta. Moderna is suing its biggest rivals in the COVID-19 vaccine market. The drug maker has filed patent infringement lawsuits against Pfizer and BioNTech in the US and Germany, accusing the two of violating patents protecting key elements of Moderna's messenger RNA technology. Moderna isn't asking the courts to pull the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccine from the market or to block future sales. The company is seeking damages for the period starting March 8th of this year. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is reinforcing his call for Russian troops to withdraw from Europe's biggest nuclear power plant after damage to transmission lines in the occupied territory disrupted power supply. The president says Ukraine is trying to prevent a nuclear accident that could impact all of Europe. The plant was captured in March when Russian troops swept through southern Ukraine. Porsche is lining up investor interest for its initial public offering. Bloomberg has learned Volkswagen's luxury automaker could have a valuation of as much as $85 billion. It would be one of Europe's biggest ever listing. Big name investors reportedly include T. Rowe Price and Qatar Investment Authority. The IPO could happen in early September. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
To name a couple of your babies. I don't know if I'm asking you to choose amongst your children, but you know, some of the most recognizable buildings by you, of course, the Millennium Bridge, London City Hall, the Reichstag, and the Great Court British Museum. What was your favorite project to do?
The Reichstag does stand out because, first of all, it's an energy manifesto. So it transformed something that was dependent on fossil fuels. It uses all the technology to produce something which is essentially carbon neutral. And as a public building, that's a statement. It's a symbol of a city. It's a symbol of a nation. It incorporates works of art. It's recycling an existing building, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the ultimate in sustainability. If you can give a new life to a building, it also creates public space at the roof level. It is the most visited parliament in the world, so it puts the public above the politicians who are answerable to them. And that, of course, was made possible by the politicians. So it's a demonstration of democracy in action.
The difference between political gossip and policy intelligence. Bloomberg Government provides our clients with expert reporting, analysis, and public affairs tools that give you the edge in reaching policymakers on the Hill. When you're in the business of influence in Washington, information and connections are the currencies on which you rely. For knowledge you can act upon, the difference is Bloomberg Government.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
They are trying to tighten financial conditions to slow the economy down, not just a little bit, slow it down so much that the inflationary pressures abate over time. That kind of slowing growth, slowing in spending in the economy can't possibly be good for earnings. I think the Fed solution, and I happen to agree with it, is slow the economy down. It's growing faster than can possibly be sustained long term.
Hello, Steph Carpenter, the Chief Global Economist at Morgan Stanley, live from Jackson Hole this morning. Good morning to you with Tom Keane and Lisa Brammitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. The price action shaping up as follows. Equity futures down about 1/4% on the S&P 500. Brammo keeps getting the heater and pushing it towards me. And I said to Brammo in the commercial break, why are you doing that? I'm worried about you. I said, why are you worried about me? You can't leave me alone with Tom. Okay? I need you to be okay for the next couple of hours.
You're exaggerating.
You can't, whatever's in that cup, you can't leave me alone with him.
Like hot tang with
what is in that cup?
Well, there's an add-on to the hot tang. There was a little,
A Bloomberg subscriber literally just messaged me that.
Oh, really? That's good. Before we get to our wonderful, wonderful guest here, it's wonderful to know that Dambisa Moyo, co-principal, co-founder of Versace Investments, watches a gentleman where his genius is hidden by his frumpy, friendly, and disarming demeanor, luring the economist into a false sense of security.
Like Columbo.
Like Columbo.
We love Columbo. Peter Falk was a genius.
He was fantastic.
Let us begin here with something we've been really cognizant of this. It's about economic growth. You have provided global leadership on screaming, don't forget EM, don't forget third world, and they're linked inextricably to we are. How does the global economy of growth respond to the various big world debates right now, including what's going on at Jackson Hole?
So, I think the fundamental problem is that we're all obsessed on tactics, and rightly so. We should care about a 40-year high in inflation. But I think with that, we forget about growth. And this is really the fundamental problem that I think will continue to be problematic over time, not just in developed economies. I mean, look at what's happening in Europe. But more generally, as you highlight, the emerging markets, with real consequences for the West, immigration, disorderly migration at the southern border of the United States, but across Europe as well. And so those knock-on effects of food and grain, inflationary pressures, both demand and supply are leading to these bigger problems.
Do you see those issues, Dambisa, and great to have you with us,
Thank you,
as one-off issues, something we can just deal with over the next 12 months and move on from, or is this something that's going to be with us for a long time?
Absolutely here for a long time. Even before the pandemic of 2020, there were a lot of structural problems that were deeply, creating a lot of problems for the global economy at that time. So things like climate, things like technology and the risk of a jobless underclass, demographic shifts, inequality. I mean, the list was already pretty large and problematic. And then you have a pandemic to make matters worse. And so inflation really is accelerating, I would argue, our direction into a much more problematic, low growth environment, which is kind of now be sort of well accepted around the world with no real solutions to addressing it.
So I want to pick up on that. You wrote a Project Syndicate article recently where you talked about how you expect inflation to be higher and more stubborn in the mid-single digits, so 4 or 5% for a long period of time. Yeah. How much is this realized? How much pushback do you get? How much is this becoming an increasingly consensus idea among your peers?
Well, I think it is. And if you look around today, I was looking at something from Bridgewater. I mean, they also think that we're going to have pretty stubborn inflation. And really it's because we know that we have both supply side as well as demand side factors that are driving inflation. And while it is true that the Federal Reserve can do a lot to attack the sort of supply side aspects, the demand side aspects in terms of balance sheet, in terms of raising rates, we know that a lot of the supply side constraints are outside of the purview and the mandate of the Fed, and that's where the problem emerges.
Do you think Fed Chair Jay Powell agrees with you?
I think he's aware. It's clear to me that he would be aware of these issues. But I do think also in the narrow sense of the mandate, and I have not spoken to him, I just saw him at breakfast a moment ago, I would say that in the narrow sense of the mandate, I think there is a broadening acceptance that the models are flawed and that the 2% bands are probably now archaic.
You just saw the chairman at the Pioneer Grill for breakfast?
Yeah, a minute ago.
There was a rumor flying around the lodge. He tipped greater than 2%. What does that signal?
Yeah, exactly.
We'll have to see. I got a serious question. You own EM and the conceit here of modern EM that this time is different. Emerging markets are stable with a better debt structure than the crises of the past. I don't buy it for 1 second. What is the vulnerability here that they have that's unspoken in 2022?
Simple word, China. They are vulnerable. China is today the largest trading partner, foreign direct investor, and lender to the majority of emerging market countries in South America, Africa, across Asia. That is the problem. If China, a weak China, which we know is weak, leads to many more problems and knock-on effects, which are already seeing food crises emanating from Russia and Ukraine. But beyond that, China's weakness means emerging market weakness.
How bad do you think things are in China right now? Typically, the way we used to look at economic data in China was that if it's good, it isn't, and if it's bad, it must be really bad. What's the story now?
So, look, I think that everyone's looking to November to hear what the reset looks like. I think that the numbers coming out of there, and they're actually, we should start off with the fact that the Chinese political class have announced infrastructure investments. They're cutting rates. They're becoming quite aggressive. That signals to me that they are worried, which means we ought to be worried. Again, not just because of China, but because of the knock-on effects for the global economy. I'm worried. And frankly, I think that we ought to be worried from a longer-term 10-year period, the demographics, the debt, but in the interim, I think also their COVID approach and also the sort of weakness in the broader global economy are all things we should be concerned about.
Don Bissamoy, just awesome, as always. Thank you for catching up with us. Tom, two pieces that came from that for me. The idea that inflation could be in the mid-single digits for a while, and we got to factor in this weaker growth backdrop in a much more material way. China, a big piece of that.
I agree with the China piece, but what we've heard from Jan Hatzius and from Dr. Moy and others is, do we get a sentence today in this speech where he finally says we need to extend the duration of our study? Because no one's doing that. James Bullard wants to front load. Front load into what?
Front load and wait. That's the difference. Raise and hold. Raise and hold is that phrase, and we've repeated it all week. Raise and hold is that phrase we've heard a lot of.
One thing that people have been saying is if they don't give forward guidance, they give a framework for their response function. How do they have a framework for a response function if we don't have a sense of where they lie in this debate of inflation and how protracted it's going to be? And I think that's something the market is grappling with right now.
You think they've got to offer some forward guidance?
I'm not saying forward guidance. I think that the framework of how they're thinking about inflation and whether they agree with what we were just talking about possibly a 4 or 5% inflation rate for years, how are they gaming that into their models?
Reinforcing the reaction function. What happens if unemployment's climbing at the end of this year and inflation's still sticky?
Exactly.
What are they doing with monetary policy?
Well, he's going to address that today, but again, what he's going to say is, we're going to hear this 5 times today, we're data dependent. I'm sorry, is widely known forward guidance is that, you know what's important? I got an email in from
is this important?
someone.
Of course it's going to be important.
I'm sure it's
100%.
not.
The sunrise, over Winteros, the sun is rising.
Lisa timed it perfectly.
It is.
The sun is rising. Can I go and do some reporting and go and have breakfast with Chairman Powell? I think that would be valuable to everybody.
Reporting.
Can I just step away and go get breakfast at the Pioneer Grill, and I'll come back and tell you what's in the speech from Jackson Hole. This is where... Every Friday with 30 minutes dedicated to fixed income, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Real Yield.
Welcome to the world of decentralized decentralized finance.
I'm going to take a look right here at regulation.
We are seeing digital currencies under some pressure.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto. The people.
I want to have some of my money outside of the sovereign.
The transactions.
It all comes down to the details here.
And the technology.
How does that affect disruptors like you?
What happens to everything that you're investing in when the last Bitcoin is mined?
Bloomberg Crypto, Tuesdays.
You do not get stronger that moment that you're lifting the barbell. You get stronger as your body is making repairs, making recovery. Recovery is a when and how you get fitter, faster, stronger.
Recovery technology includes everything from massage guns and foam rollers to compression boots, hyperbaric chambers, cryo chambers, infrared saunas, and even infrared pajamas. And athletes are partnering to become investors to take those products mainstream.
When you look at tech in sports right now, it's completely innovating the way training's going, completely changing the way recovery's going. I think sky's the limit as far as where it can go.
But while some of these products can feel amazing, it can be difficult to differentiate between what really helps the body and what just tricks the mind.
Every time you're chasing the latest, greatest, newest tool, you're probably chasing a mirage.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Griffin is moving both Citadel and Citadel Securities to Miami. The scoop was broken by Bloomberg's Amanda Gordon.
Live from Jackson Hole, Wyoming this morning. Good morning to you all. In a couple of hours from now, we'll hear from the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell. That will take place at about 10 a.m. Eastern time. That's 8 a.m. local, so just about 90 minutes away. Futures are negative about 1/3% on the S&P 500, bouncing back just a little bit, now down by around about 0.2% or so. Whole host of economic data that I need to bring to you. I said to Bill Dudley, how do you want your data served? And he said, I would like core deflator year-over-year PCE. I don't have it available for me right now. I do have personal income though. That's his breakfast. You can have that in a moment. Personal income comes in at 0.2% against an estimate of 0.6. Spending at 0.1% against an estimate of 0.5. I can get you that core deflator now, Mr. Dudley. 4.6%, down from 4.8. That's year over year. 4.7% was the estimate. The core deflator month over month, a bit softer too, 0.1% against an estimate of 0.2. That's down from 0.6. So unsurprisingly, the equity market bouncing back just a little bit. The S&P, Lisa, almost unchanged now, and yields at the front end actually lower on a session by a couple of basis points.
So this makes sense because basically you had a good downside surprise for those who want to see inflation coming off faster than expected. Interesting to me, the personal spending aspect, that this is being viewed as positive, even though personal spending came in at a 0.1% gain, really underwhelming. How much does that really speak to the weakness that some people say isn't priced in?
So that's the core deflator. I'll give you the PCE deflator year over year, 6.3%. That's down from 6.8. The estimate was 6.4. Month over month, negative 0.1. The previous month of 1%. That gives you an idea of how punchy June was. So this is July data. 0% was the estimate. So Tom, looking at the inflation numbers across PCE, softer across the board here, and some indication as to why your equity market is reversing some of those losses this morning.
And showing how forward guidance has disappeared in data is what matters.
Without a doubt. And I would state though, Tom, 1 month. 1 month.
But a series, a whole lot of data to come in September before an historic September FOMC meeting. Right now, we are thrilled to welcome someone who is a contributor, which barely describes his service to Bloomberg Opinion, and of course, his public service to the nation as the former president of the New York Fed. Bill Dudley invented modern economics at Goldman Sachs. We're thrilled that he could join us today. Bill, if we see inflation come in at any given level, why do we still need to be so strident about raising interest rates?
Because getting inflation down to 4% is not getting the job done. If the Fed quits, let's say, with inflation at 4%, inflation expectations will become unanchored, and then the Federal Reserve will just have to do more in the future. We ran this whole experiment in the 1970s where policy was tightened, economy had recession, inflation came down, but it didn't come down enough. And so every trough in inflation was higher through that whole decade until Paul Volcker came in 1979 and had to do a lot.
Parse the distinction of a John Taylor of Stanford on Bloomberg 4 or 5 days ago, heated on the need to be responsible and get back to 2%. The Olivier Blanchard work of 2008-9, Sir Howard Davies in England agreeing with Dr. Blanchard, Adam Posen sitting in your chair moments ago saying 3%. State the public reason public officials say we must get back to 2%.
So let's say you get back to 3% and you're just hanging out at 3%, and the next thing takes the inflation back up again. Then you've actually ratified a higher inflation floor. That gets into inflation expectations, that gets into wages, and then we're off to the races. That's the problem. If you're at 3% and you knew you were going to 2% over the next few years, there's no problem. But if you're at 3% and the next move is up, then you're back in the 1970s.
It sounds like to me that you think the bigger mistake to make today would be to do too little, not too much.
Yeah, I mean, I think the message that we're going to hear from Chair Powell is why inflation needs to be brought back down to 2% and what's required to do that. I don't think he's going to be focusing on the short term, like in terms of like what's going to happen in September. He's going to be talking about what do we need to do, why do we need to do it, why the alternatives of not doing it are very unattractive.
There's two ways of doing this. There's the simplistic way that you just keep on hiking until you see 2%. It's another way of saying that you get to that kind of trajectory where you start to see things moving back towards 2% and you can pause. Can you help me understand the latter view of things and what we should be looking for in the next few months?
Well, I think once they get to what they think is a true tight monetary policy setting, which they're not at yet, then there is a ability to sit back and see how the tightness of monetary policy is accomplishing the mission of generating more slack in the labor market, which is what is needed to push inflation down 2%. The Fed's problem is bigger than the problem of a year ago because the labor market is too tight. The unemployment rate is too low. It's hard for the Fed to talk about that because obviously if the unemployment rate is too low, that means you'd have to put people out of work to get inflation back down to 2%. But that's the Fed's problem. A year ago, the Fed thought it was just about transitory inflation. That would pass as the supply chains normalized. Now they're fighting a bigger problem. The labor market is too tight. So they have to slow the economy down sufficiently to push the unemployment rate up to somewhere in the a range of 4 to 5%.
Bill, you've written a lot of columns that have been highly critical of this current Fed and what they've done and how they've really communicated the pain that's been required. How has the reception been of some of those arguments at this confab here?
Well, I think people understand that I'm not making my criticism personal in any respect. And when the Fed does a good job, like they did in the early days of the pandemic, I've been very, very supportive of those actions. So I sort of call it as I see it. I'm like the umpire, balls and strikes. And if they do a good job, I'm going to tell people that they're doing a good job. And if they make a mistake, I'm going to talk about that as well.
So with respect to the bigger framework that we're looking at, we've been talking a lot this morning about what kind of inflation rate we can expect in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And this idea that maybe it's not going to really be 2%, maybe it's going to be 4% or 5% for years because some of these structural changes. How has this Fed prepared for that? What is the likely policy response that we can expect?
Well, if the world has fundamentally changed, so globalization is reversing, supply chains need to be onshored, and that's going to cause less productivity growth and higher inflation pressures, then the Federal Reserve is going to have to respond to that by having a tighter monetary policy. Interest rates will just be higher now than they were, say, following the great financial crisis. I think the problem that markets have, is they're looking at the last cycle as the template for where we are today, right. And I think we're actually in a quite different place, given all the things that have happened globally.
So many people in your camp, including Dr. Arian, say somehow we'll survive. There's one other group that says the world will come to an end if we get a Dudley outcome. You lived this with Ed McKelvey at Goldman Sachs. How does the Dudley rate regime you're calling for affect business, affect investment, affect trade?
Well, I think people are getting a little bit overwrought. I mean, the economy has a lot of positive elements. Household balance sheets, business balance sheets are in good shape. We're not talking about the Fed trying to generate a deep recession. We're talking about the Fed trying to nudge up the unemployment rate a bit to push inflation down a bit. And, you know, the inflation, as we saw today, the inflation is going to come off quite a bit as you unwind some of these transitory factors. You know, this transitory, non-transitory debate, it was a little bit oversimplified because there were elements of the inflation that are transitory and there are elements that are much more sort of built into the system in terms of the labor market.
Do you think that this economy, you've talked about this before, is less interest rate sensitive than perhaps some people give credit to, that it can basically sustain the kind of rates at 4 or 5% without crashing?
I mean, let's just reflect back on history. 4 to 5% interest rates are not particularly high interest rates. You know, if you look at 2004 to 2006, the Fed took the federal funds rate from 1% to 5.25%.
We didn't have this much debt, though.
Well, the debt we have today is mostly at the federal government level, not in the households and businesses. If you think about what actually happened during the pandemic, the government's handed out lots of money to people. The government debt went up a lot, but household and business debt is actually not in particularly is in reasonable shape.
Can I squeeze this in because you're the perfect person to ask, and I'll whisper it because there's some Fed officials around us. Do they speak too much? I've just had that question from a Bloomberg subscriber. Do we hear too much from the regional Fed presidents?
Well, I think it's fine for the regional Fed presidents to give their views. I think the audience, though, should understand who's important. And who's really important as a speaker is Jay Powell.
We're not stopping this. Let's continue this conversation.
Jay Powell is the guy you should be listening to. Jay Powell is the guy you should be listening to.
Anyone else?
Of course. I think John Williams and Lael Brainerd, they're part of the troika. That's the three people that meet often to talk
just
about.
Just for people who aren't familiar with who Bill Dudley is, former New York Fed president, part of the troika.
Yeah, exactly.
he was the guy who should.
I can't spell troika.
Does anyone else matter?
But the chair is the key person. That's why this speech today is going to get so much attention.
But Bill Dudley, the heart of this matter with your academics at Berkeley and others, you just mentioned a group of people skilled in PhDs of economics and monetary policy. Are you suggesting that there's a two-tier central bank structure now of the PhDs in monetary theory and everybody else?
No, I'm not. I'm just saying that there's a few key seats. The chairman's seat, the vice chairman of the FOMC, the vice chairman of the Board of Governors. They're a little bit more equal than others.
Why don't we see much dissent, Bill?
I think we don't see much dissent because I think people basically bought into the transitory inflation story. The speech a year ago was correct in a lot of respects. I mean, there were a lot of, the shift in demand from services to goods did push upward pressure on goods prices, and we knew that was going to revert once we reopened the economy. But what the Fed missed, I think, was the labor market. The labor market turned out to be much tighter, much sooner than they expected.
Did this occur because all of us, including public servants, were slaves to Greenspan's measured approach? Were we so indoctrinated with the Greenspanian measured that we couldn't get away from it?
Well, I think I would say it's actually more fighting the last war. So coming out of the great financial crisis, wanted to be very careful, very cautious, hard to get inflation up to 2%. So the focus was on getting inflation up, because that's what the problem last time was. And it turned out that it wasn't a difficult thing to accomplish.
As you said in this interview, we're not going back to that, are we? You don't think we're going back to that?
I don't think we're going back to that.
Bill Dudley.
But we'll see.
A Bloomberg opinion and the former New York Fed president. Lisa, that's a point you've raised all week.
Well, this is the fundamental question, right? If we don't go back to that, that's what Stephen Major is basically basing his whole premise on. If we don't go back to that, how much do markets have to readjust? How mispriced are so many aspects of this market?
What they're geared for is a return to that.
Correct.
Because every time you get a rally in this market, where does the leadership come from?
It comes from, the same places. Yeah, exactly.
NASDAQ, this idea that we can get back to that old world. Fascinating stuff. Chairman Powell, about 1 hour and 20 minutes away, something like that. It's going to be a nice little walk. Tom, it's going to be a nice little walk. He's going to take that shot. Tom's going to walk with them. I'd love that. You should walk with them. That would be great. You should go and walk with them.
Security will take them out.
Walk with them. From Jackson Hole this morning. Good morning.
What are you doing, Colombo?
Colombo's here. Where's Colombo?
Yeah, exactly. How do you break in?
Yeah, you could play the Colombo.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Ritika Gupta. Moderna is suing its biggest rivals in the COVID-19 vaccine market. The drug maker has filed patent infringement lawsuits against Pfizer and BioNTech in the US and Germany, accusing the two of violating patents protecting key elements of Moderna's messenger RNA technology. Moderna isn't asking the courts to pull the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccine from the market or to block future sales. The company is seeking damages for the period starting March 8th of this year. Beijing and Washington have reached a preliminary agreement to allow American officials to review audit documents of Chinese businesses. It's a first step towards avoiding the delisting of some 200 firms from New York. The deal marks a breakthrough for resolving a decades-long standoff between the two superpowers that has threatened to delist Chinese tech giants such as Alibaba and Baidu from U.S. exchanges. And India is set to curb some of its rice exports, a move that could cause trouble in global food markets. Bloomberg has learned the government is considering the move as local prices soar. India accounts for 40% of global rice trade, and restricting exports would deal a further blow to countries grappling with a cost of living crisis and worsening hunger. Germany is considering restricting the companies able to benefit from a new gas levy just to those that really need the help. The government has faced scrutiny following an outcry over soaring profits at some energy companies. Germany initiated the plan over concerns that failures of gas companies could trigger wider disruption in energy deliveries to Europe's biggest economy. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
So is there more pressure when you're trying to win a basketball championship than when you're trying to please investors? Where's the greater pressure?
Oh, I think it's definitely trying to win a championship. It's hard because a lot of, like when you invest, and you know this, when you're investing, you can control a lot more things. When, you know, on a basketball court, you can't control whether somebody's going to make a shot. You've got to get lucky.
And what's the greater pleasure, making 5 times your money on a distressed debt investment or winning the NBA championship?
They're both fabulous. I wish I could do one each year. That would be great. But I think there's a great feeling in being right on an investment that you've done a tremendous amount of work and you've made money for your clients, which I think is great. I think winning a championship it's a very surreal feeling because there's a whole city or state that is actually behind you. You know, we had 70,000 people at the finals, and we had them all outside. You had 17,000 in the stands, and then literally like 60,000 people outside. And when we won, like just the joy that you had brought to the city was phenomenal.
Make it very transparent to the shopper before they accept an order, what the order is going to look like, how much we're going to pay them, and how much like the consumer is paying them. And so they can decide whether they take an order or whether they refuse it. And that's the kind of flexibility that our shoppers really value and the kind of transparency that they want.
Are you seeing a labor shortage right now? And what are you doing to combat that?
It's different in different places. Our demographic of shoppers is completely different from food delivery and ride sharing. We're 70% women and half of them are moms. And that's because a lot of the job at Instacart is very different than just being in a car with strangers. It's about like going to the store, doing a good job of customer service, of really picking the right products for the consumer. And we are seeing that being very appealing to women.
In a $7 trillion industry, there's a lot of ground to cover.
Prepare for an economic hurricane.
We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, Monday on Bloomberg.
The pressure to get back down to 2% is going to involve some very unpleasant decisions by the Fed and indeed by the Bank of England. What I'm concerned about is that on the current regime, the central banks are set up to fail. And I think that would be a bad outcome and then would be putting at risk their whole basis of independence.
Howard Davis there, the chairman of NatWest Group, the former deputy governor of the Bank of England. I'm not sure if the microphones picked it up, but Bill Dudley, the former New York Fed president, just moments ago, saying that he did kind of look like Columbo and he should go up to Chairman Powell and just say one more question.
Exactly. He was really encouraging him.
That was just the perfect idea, TK.
That's good. You're killing me. I've never seen Columbo.
No, you haven't. Come on.
I've never seen
You must have.
No, we didn't have a TV. No.
You must have.
We did not have
You've
a
got
TV.
a TV
in the house.
now. You still did the replays.
Yeah, but all I do is watch Red Sox baseball. I mean,
That's miserable.
Yes, it was. It was a miserable childhood. If you want to get personal, it was a miserable childhood. That's true. Should we continue?
I'm going to pick
Did you have a data check to save here?
Just a
Thank
small
you.
one. 10-year yields up by 3 basis points to about 3%. Moments ago, we had some PCE data here from the United States. That came in a little bit softer.
Good data.
So yields pulled back for a moment, but not for long. Higher by a basis point on a 2-year, back to 337. And on the equity market, futures negative again, 0.2%. Seemingly and understandably, no big moves, Tom, going into Chairman Powell about an hour and 11 minutes away.
What we're going to do right now, we're going to digress with 2 questions, one to the present, one to the past, and then John and Lisa will pick it up with David Malpass. He is, of course, the president of the World Bank, and far more than that, owned the high ground at Bear Stearns Economics for many years. First, Mr. Malpass, we need to go to the immediacy. You arrive injured on set because you sighted a grizzly bear in Jellystone Park like yesterday. Did you have to run from the bear? John Farrow needs a grizzly bear briefing right now.
I was in Yellowstone Park. Okay. It's incredible. This is incredible behind us. And I have to say, I watched Columbo. I grew up on Columbo. We finally got a TV.
Are we close?
And so that last question is the clincher.
Is the clincher? What would be your last question?
You're not supposed to run from a bear because the bear is going to win that. So
there you go.
There you go.
There's news you can use. Yeah. I want to go to the history of David Malpass at Bear Stearns with Alan Meltzer, and I sat on this lawn with a professor from Carnegie Mellon, and he defended the integrity of the Fed in the crisis of 07, 08, and 09. What does the chairman need to say today to reaffirm the integrity of the Fed?
Confidence is really important. Stagflation is hard to get out of, and the Fed, as it's raising interest rates, is fighting uphill with the friction in the global system. It'd be one thing if people looked at it and could see to the other side and say, oh, I'm going to make new investments and produce a lot more. But that doesn't seem to be what the world is doing. So you're getting that reduction in demand as the rate hikes go through, but not getting commensurate supply increases. I think that's where the focus needs to be, both for the central banks and especially the United States. This is the biggest economy, so how can it produce a lot more of everything at a time when the prices are high? So what are the blockages that are keeping production from going higher?
David, you just used the S word. Is that what this is? Stagflation?
Stagflation means higher inflation than you want and lower growth, and clearly we have that. Years later in history books, they'll maybe mark it as, we hope, a short period. But my worry, and a deep worry for developing countries and for people in lower income levels, is that the stagflation may last for quite a while. They get hurt because the inflation hurts them and the slow growth hurts them at the same time.
In June, you downgraded your expectation for global GDP to 2.9% for this year. We've seen some pretty terrible data out of China. We've seen some developments with the energy crisis that's percolating in Europe. Are you lowering that still?
We'll make another forecast ahead, and the IMF will be doing forecasts on. So, but my worry is that things have gone worse from that already low forecast. China in the second quarter, it looks like might have been minus 3% year over year. So a really difficult because of their shutdown. And as we look at Europe, they're trying to buy natural gas from around the world, but the producers aren't stepping up. So one of the challenges is how do you refill their storage that was drained by Russia the previous year?
Okay, so here we are in Jackson Hole. What is the response mechanism from the Fed, from the ECB, with China flat on its back, with a world that's in stagflation at best, and you still see that inflationary impulse coming in strong?
It's not all on the Fed. It's got to be a range of policies. The Fed also does regulatory policy. It does policy as far as the choice of the composition of its assets. That's one of the topics that people will be discussing here. And that has a big impact on the supply side of the economy. And then the governments around the world, the advanced economies, are demanding, are using a lot of the world's capital for their own needs, for government workers. And that makes it hard for the new supply that's needed. Again, the U.S. is the giant swing producer in the world, and you'd like to see those numbers, the output numbers for the U.S., expected output going up and up and up this year and next year.
Tom's freezing and can't speak, so I'll ask the question he wants to ask. Is ESG dead?
There are a lot of important issues as the world thinks about how to invest. One is profit, and then you want a world that's better. And so, how do you mix that? I think corporations have to look for their shareholders. ESG and environment, social, and development governance issues are really hard to tackle. World Bank is a leader in that, and for people in poor countries, it's really important. So we're going to continue doing ESG, but I think from a regulatory standpoint, regulators have to look at how do we get more production. For the poor in the world, the most important thing is to have electricity, have some way forward in terms of farm machinery so that you can plant next year's crop. And right now, that's not happening in a lot of the world.
That's been a big theme for Lisa all week. President Malpass, just wonderful to catch up. What a scene, hey?
Yeah,
you've got a good slot. Can I just say that you've got a good slot? The sun's up in Jackson Hole.
Has it gotten warmer?
There's a better view. It's getting gradually it's getting warmer. Gradually it's getting warmer. I'm worried about Tom, who just can't speak anymore. To have 5-minute gaps of Tom not speaking is quite kind of unsettling sometimes.
It is unsettling.
Can I squeeze one thing in with
You've got literally 40 seconds.
Incredibly important chart. Yeah.
My observation is gold in dollar terms is not going up, so that's a comforting sign. We've got some currency weakness in the euro. You know, there used to be more talk about currency stability. I think the central banks can look forward and say, look, this is not hyperinflation. It's not getting out of control. We need a lot more production.
I thought you'd squeeze the Swissy in there, Tom.
But we could do all that with Malpass.
President Malpass, I know we can. We can go back decades. Thank you, sir. Tom,
Thank you.
The big one coming up, about an hour away.
It is. It's going to be an important speech, and we've got the people in the next hour to define what they'll be listening for, the Fed presidents.
The Fed presidents, and we start, I believe, with President Hercules.
Yeah, he's coming
in
up.
about 5 minutes' time.
How much is front-loading an issue for him, and how does he see keeping rates longer for how long?
In the next hour, a whole host of Fed presidents, including President Harker, President Bullard, and President Boston. What would you like to say?
It's house surveillance, and winter is here.
what's happening on Wall Street.
I think Jay Powell said things that were indefensible.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights
We think that's the next secular shift.
from businesses most influential and instrumental.
Yes, it's about renewables.
It's a challenging dynamic.
This is a level of uncertainty that we haven't had to deal with.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live tonight with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
China's appetite for energy is enormous. The country consumes about a quarter of the world's energy supply, 35% more than the US annually. Its energy needs have more than tripled since the year 2000. That consumption has helped to fuel astonishing growth, but it's come at a cost.
China is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. There is no way to tackle climate change unless China reduces its emissions to net zero.
The country's reliance on fossil fuels is also a hindrance to its own growth and the well-being of its citizens.
China is not energy secure. It has a massive import bill for things like oil and gas. It has a long-standing pollution problem, and it is also prone to outages that severely hamper industry.
All this has led the world's biggest polluter to take steps towards a radical transformation.
No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
There's a sense it'll get to 7% in the coming months. Do you see that coming true?
There was something of a grey zone battle between Taiwan and China.
Where are the job cuts to come from? We will not just cut and run.
With unmatched reach and resources from more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, your global business authority.
The difference between political gossip and policy intelligence. Bloomberg Government provides our clients with expert reporting, analysis, and public affairs tools that give you the edge in reaching policymakers on the Hill. When you're in the business of influence in Washington, information and connections are the currencies on which you rely. For knowledge you can act upon, the difference is Bloomberg Government.
This is an extended edition of Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Live from Jackson Hole, Wyoming this morning. Good morning for our audience worldwide. In about 60 minutes from now, right here, we'll hear from the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, with equity futures totally unchanged, as you might expect them to be going into this one. And a bond market, Lisa Abramowitz, looking a little something like this. At the front end, unchanged as well, your 2-year, 336.
Yeah, we got some data that was a good downside surprise in terms of inflation. Who wants to trade ahead of what could be a monumental discussion, something that everyone's been trading around, anticipating, in a market that's moving more in tandem as a macro market than it has in 17 years?
Tom Keene is so cold that he's gone inside to get warm, and we get lucky. Mike McKee is sitting alongside us today, this morning, through the next hour. A ton of fantastic guests coming right up, including President Harker of the Philadelphia Fed. We'll hear from James Bullard of the St. Louis Fed. We'll also hear from Raphael Bostic of the Atlanta Fed, and going into Chairman Powell, Jason Furman, who's made a lot of headlines in the last couple of days about what he thinks about student loans and this administration. So we're all looking forward to that. We've got to start with this one right here, though. Patrick Harker, the president of the Philadelphia Fed. Mr. President, I think you've got a good slot, because about an hour ago, it was much colder than this. Good morning to you.
Oh, it's still cold, guys.
It hasn't warmed up. Thank you. It's gotten 2 degrees warmer.
Let's get straight into it. Forget about the weather. We've got a beautiful backdrop. I want to start here. As we sit here today, the biggest risk today, is it doing too much for you guys or doing too little?
Well, I think what we need to do is just act, and we're acting. And so I think we need to move, and we need to move methodically toward a clearly restrictive stance, which we're doing. And then, in my view, then we either pause, depending on the data. We're going to have to see how this plays out. We get to above 3.4 by year end. We're at or above 3.4. And then we see, we have to let some of this play out. We don't have to keep climbing, and then
it go down very quickly. Let's stay up there and let the economy do its thing.
So for how long, right? And this is sort of Jan Hatzius' point, where he said, keep it there for possibly years and see the trickle-out effect.
We don't know. I mean, we really need to let the data play out. You just don't know a priori.
What data are you looking at?
Inflation, number one, for sure. That's the issue. That's
headline
the
or
issue.
core?
Well, core for sure, because the volatility of energy and food is extreme, particularly because of the situation we have in Ukraine and around the world.
This has been this whole setup and the chairman's speech, something of a totemic issue for Wall Street, and everybody's going to be tuning in at the top of the next hour. What's the message that the Fed would like investors to take away today?
I don't know what the Fed has. I can only speak for myself. I think the message is from me that we need to get inflation under control. We will do what it takes to get inflation under control. And hopefully we can do that in a way that does not ruin what otherwise is a good economy. You look at the jobs data, you look at other parts of the economy. We don't want to do this in a way that really just squashes the jobs market right now.
Is this whatever it takes, or is this Mario Draghi, whatever it takes? Because everybody on Wall Street wants to know, would you risk recession to bring inflation down?
It's possible. It's always possible to have a recession. At this point, I don't think it's in my forecast that it's probable. I think we can still do this. There's still a path to do this. To have, if there is a recession, it would be shallow and short, in my view.
There's two camps. One says get to the terminal rate as quickly as possible to get ahead of inflation. The other says move more slowly because you want to make sure that the lags don't bring down the economy. Which camp are you in?
Again, where I am is let's get up to the clearly restrictive stance. 3.4 is a good number, 3.5. And then let's see how things play out from there.
This word neutral has been thrown around a lot in the last couple of weeks. You're smiling already. So talk to me about what you think neutral is. What's restrictive? What is it, and how do we know?
It's clearly above 3, for sure. How much above? Again, I think we just have to see. Today's data, we can talk about that. We're seeing glimmers of hope, and I emphasize glimmers of hope on the inflation front. We're not done, and so we need to continue to raise rates to make sure that those glimmers turn into a clear downward trend.
How do you know when we have a clear downward trend? And clearly, as you've pointed out, there's two ways of looking at this. You keep hiking until you see 2%. That's clearly not where you want to go. You want to get to this place where you're restricted and you're waiting and you're convinced that we've got this trajectory, that we're moving back down towards 2. I think what we'd all like is just a better understanding of what that world looks like. How do we know when we see that world?
So clearly we have the numbers, right, core and headline. I also look at the distribution of inflation. That is, how many goods and services are above 5%, above 4%. As we see that distribution shrink again, think about the beginning of the pandemic. It was all about used cars and some other commodities. Let's start to bring that down, because right now it's pretty widespread. That, to me, would be a clear sign that we're making progress.
Financial conditions are an important mechanism for you to get your policy into the economy. Would you say we've seen an unwarranted easing of financial conditions through the summer?
I don't know if it's unwarranted, but we need to continue to do what we have to do with respect to the Fed funds rate, which we've committed.
But clearly financial conditions would need to be tighter for you to achieve that.
Well, no, let's talk about the housing market. And we already have a very tight housing market. So there already is progress being made.
So you're comfortable. You don't believe there's a disconnect between what you're saying as a committee and what you're seeing play out in financial conditions?
Not yet. I mean, it's something clearly watch, but I'm not worried about it at this point.
Unemployment. You're expecting that to rise a little bit. That's the Fed's message. But at the same time, you're saying that at 3.5%, it's below the natural rate. So how much of a rise is acceptable to you? And what do you say to the people who say, it's just a tiny rise, but it was my job?
Yeah, I know. And that's what's difficult. And this is the balance, right, that we have to try to find. Because we know inflation hurts the lowest income people in our country, and because of losing jobs, it hurts those people the most too. So we have to find that balance. How much higher, it's hard to say exactly. I'm not in the camp of it being necessarily at 5%. We're going into this with an incredibly strong job market. This is not like other situations we've had historically. So I think we don't have to see a rapid rise in unemployment to get inflation under control at this point.
So Adam Posen was on earlier, and he was talking about how there has to be an acceptance of perhaps 3% for a longer period of time. That yes, maybe the trajectory has to be okay, but that has to be a tolerated inflation rate. Do you think that that's appropriate given the concerns about unemployment?
So I think what's most important is we keep moving toward 2. Exactly the pace at which we get to 2, I'm less worried about that, but we keep moving forward, right? And get to a position where inflation is consistently going down. That's the most important thing.
So do you not buy the argument that if inflation remains above a certain point, regardless of the trajectory, for a long time, it gets into the psyche of Americans, and then they start to sort of have a self-fulfilling prophecy with inflation? You don't believe that?
No, the number one risk is getting inflation expectations unanchored. We cannot let that happen. So far, it's not happened. We need to continue to act to make sure it doesn't.
So are you watching the University of Michigan 1 to 5 year, 5 to 10 year forecast? Is that sort of the key data point?
He's already laughing. all of the above. You look at all the above, whether it's the New York Fed survey or tips markets, all those measures.
So what's the response function to that?
Doing what we're doing right now, continuing to move rates up methodically to get inflation down, period.
Well, you mentioned the consumer. When you look at the economy these days, what do you see? We got the PCE numbers today. The inflation data were great. Wages and salaries were great, but spending was weak.
Well, that's to be expected, right? As we raise rates and we're trying to slow demand, you would expect that spending would come down.
Are you worried about recession? I know that you say it doesn't have to happen, but what do you think the odds are? And is there any way to foresee it given the unusual nature of this recession and recovery?
So at this point, it's not in my forecast that we'd hit a deep recession. Not at all.
Short and shallow is something we keep hearing.
Yeah,
you mentioned it 4 minutes ago.
Yeah.
12 months ago, the buzzword, you know what that was?
Yeah.
I won't mention it because it's like toxic around here.
A bell rings and you're ejected.
That was clearly a massive failure. And it wasn't unique to this central bank.
Right.
A lot of people would say it on this program a million times. We discussed it with Mike McKee a million times. It was also a story that played out abroad and then didn't materialize.
Right.
Do you worry that we're doing that again by having this conversation? Because I can tell you, President Harker, every single day, short, shallow, short, shallow. Yeah. It's all they hear. It's all we hear every single day. Do you think we could be getting this wrong again?
I'm not sure that we'd be getting it wrong again. Go back and what did we miss? I think what did I miss? Go back to where we were. Not enough emphasis on the soft data. And the situation is changing very rapidly. The data is lagging, and in particular, it's lagging in those quick change moments. So more emphasis on the soft data is really important. What we're hearing from our contacts is the soft data. They're starting to see supply chain constraints ease a little bit. They're starting to see some relief when it comes to hiring. Not everywhere, but in some cases, and they don't plan on laying people off at this point. They worked very hard to get the people they have. They don't want to let them go. So I think in that situation, I'm not sure that we're mischaracterizing a short and shallow potential, and emphasize potential recession.
As you've said, though, this cycle has moved very quickly, and there's a feeling that the post-financial crisis communication architecture of this Federal Reserve held you back in the last 12 months. What needs to change?
Well, I think we need to keep emphasizing that what we know, what we don't know, what we can know, what we can't know, and act appropriately. I mean, people want a level of precision in a situation that we're in, where we keep getting hit by issue after issue after issue. Now it's droughts globally, right? Where it's just impossible to put that level of precision on these numbers.
Would you like the dot plot to be thrown into the trash? Would you like to see that gone?
I think we need to continue to communicate with the American people about what our views are. The beauty of the Fed is we have a diversity of opinions, and you see those in the dots.
President Harker of the Philadelphia Fed, thank you, sir. It's good to catch up. Mike McKee, I know you've said it a few times. Is that something you'd like to see gone out of the summary of economic projections?
Well, I wouldn't speak for the Fed, but I can tell you Wall Street continually misinterprets it as a plan rather than 19 individual forecasts.
It's something that a chairman often sometimes, though, leans on when it's good for the chairman to lean on. Other times it's something he de-emphasizes.
You know, it's such a tricky moment right now, because when you talk about the data dependency, I just keep going back to 2021 and how the data was wrong. how when it got revised in the jobs formation, it showed this incredible strength that hadn't been foreseen in the same kind of way. So how do you remain data dependent and look for that trajectory if it's so noisy and we're dealing with so many different disparate
But unfortunately for them, it's the only tool they've got. It's the only thing they can do, so they can't say, gee, we wish we had the revised numbers. Look at yesterday, GDP gets revised up and gross domestic income is positive. And that makes, those two things don't add up.
It's a long road.
There's something clearly wrong with the measurement right now, given that gap between GDP and GDI.
President Harker, it's fantastic to catch up with you, sir. In just a moment, we'll catch up with President Bullard of the St. Louis Fed. We'll then catch up with Raphael Bostic of the Atlanta Fed. President Bostic will be joining us around about 9:30 Eastern Time. Then on to Jason Furman. We'll hear from Jason Furman a little bit later as we count you down to that Chairman Powell address right here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. That's going to take place at 8 a.m. local, so that's 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Going into all of that, we can take a sneak peek at a price action going into the opening bout around about 15 minutes away, 16, 17, 18 minutes away. Futures look a little something like this on the S&P 500. On the S&P, all through this morning, we were negative for most of this morning. Now we flip positive by 1/3% on the S&P 500. Yield shaping up as follows on a 10-year, coming in around about a basis point or two on a 10-year yield. About 3% this morning, almost unchanged. Down 2 basis points on a 2-year to 3.35. From Jackson Hole this morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg.
Cryptocurrencies have been very popular. And if a client came to you and said, look, I'd like some cryptocurrencies in my portfolio, what would you say?
Oh, we've actually been really deep into crypto, deep into learning about blockchain, and all of the new businesses. You know, I would characterize this as crypto learners. You know, we have made a series of toehold investments on behalf of our clients, both in some of the currency baskets as well as with some venture firms that are investing primarily in the crypto area. I think it has the potential to be completely game-changing, but it is still such the Wild West, and so it's so uncertain. But it has the potential to completely upend everything.
Innovation, money, and power collide in Silicon Valley and beyond. Bloomberg Technology with Emily Chang. Weekdays at 5 p.m. in New York and 2 p.m. in San Francisco.
Thinking big from the beginning. I mean, the reason that I was interested in doing this in the first place was a much bigger challenge than making a comfortable shoe or doing something in the fashion industry as a narrow opportunity. We thought that there was a big leadership opportunity. We looked around at an industry where there was 20 billion pairs of sneakers made every single year, and it was 100% made from plastic and the hides from cows, and it was terrible for the environment. And we thought that we could offer something to consumers that was differentiated in the way it feels, more comfortable, higher performance, and do that because we use sustainable materials. And in doing so, we could take a really interesting leadership opportunity and grab that and use that to tell a totally different story and compete on a totally different vector than what the rest of the industry were doing.
We'll do what it takes to get inflation under control. And hopefully, we can do that in a way that does not ruin what otherwise is a good economy. You look at the jobs data, you look at other parts of the economy. We don't want to do this in a way that really just squashes the jobs market.
Patrick Harker of the Philadelphia Fed just moments ago right here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. In around about 40 minutes or so, we'll hear from the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, in Jackson Hole. I just got a message, Mike McKee. Just remember, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the slowest person in your group.
Yeah.
There you go. Right on cue.
I think I know who that is.
Right on cue. Guess who's back? Tom Keene. Bramo's taking a little break. Welcome back, Tom.
It's good. It's good to be back. It's nice that winter is over and it's becoming a more pleasant day. And again, John, this speech is so important in 40 minutes. We welcome immediately here the gentleman from St. Louis at Indiana University, James Bullard, joins us with all of his effort over the years, and particularly his research effort a bit ago on regime change that had a profound effect 7, 8, 9 years ago. And there's a new phrase from Jim Bullard right now we'll get right to, and that is the phrase of the moment, front-loading. Jim Bullard, what is front-loading?
I think we wanted to pull the rate increases forward in time because the inflation that we got in 2021 sort of exploded onto the scene. So we had to move more quickly than we would have historically. But that's appropriate for this situation as we're coming out of the pandemic and we've got, a lot of fiscal policy, a lot of monetary policy during the pandemic.
One of the questions that Wall Street has had after Chairman Powell has spoken in the past is he said that at some point it's appropriate to slow the pace of increases, and they take that as dovish. Others push back and say it's not how fast we do it, it's where we go. Do you agree with that? That the pace doesn't really matter as much as what the terminal rate is?
I think the pace matters a little bit. You do have to get to the level of the policy rate that will put downward pressure on inflation now. And we've been able to get some downward pressure on inflation during the first half of this year. Most of that came through market pricing, not through the actual level of the funds rate. But now you have to follow through and get the funds rate to a level that's defensible, that you can say, hey, I'm putting downward pressure on inflation. We've got an 8 handle on headline CPI inflation. This is more inflation than we've seen in 40 years. We've got to get the rate up.
Well, the concern that some members of the committee have had is that, as you said, it's been market pricing. It's not the full effects yet of the tightening. And when that hits, the economy may be weak, and then you're doing a disservice by sending us into recession.
You know, long and variable lags was something uttered by Milton Friedman, but that was based on data from the 50s and 60s. I think today's markets, partly because of media like this, they move very quickly in response to projected paths of policy. And I would cite as exhibit number 1, the housing market, which has already slowed down substantially in the spring here. And it started to do that before we even made much of a move. We would only move 25 or made 1 or 2 moves and hadn't even started the balance sheet runoff. So I don't think this long and variable lags thing is as accurate as it might have been historically. I think you're getting a lot of the impact now. But we can't just rely on markets. We have to get our rate up to the level that will put downward pressure on inflation. I've said 3.75 to 4% by the end of this year. I'd like to get to that level, and sooner is better as far as I'm concerned.
A lot of people have said neutral is higher than the chairman suggested. We were there almost at 2.5%, but inflation is making the need to go higher.
That's a long-run neutral. That you can read that off the summary of economic projections, and that's if the economy was on the balanced growth path, inflation was at 2%, expected to remain at 2%, then that would be a logical level for the policy rate then. But that's not where we are today. We've got all this inflation, and we've got a very strong labor market, so that's why it makes sense to go well above that to a recommended policy rate that's well above that.
Has that longer run neutral point changed for you? Has that had a lift? Do you think we go back to the old world, the pre-pandemic world of low inflation, low growth, and a lower long-term neutral rate? What are we going towards?
You know, I don't like to get wrapped up in this because this is the thing we know the least about. So it's good to think about it, and it's good to project about it, but we don't really know where everything will settle out, let's say 5 to 10 years from now. But you know, you've got this immediate problem now where you've got the inflation today. That's where you got to fight your battle today.
Can you tell me where balance sheet reduction fits into that? We've heard numbers like $1 trillion of balance sheet reduction over the next 12 months. What is that to you in terms of tightening policy, and how does that complement your thoughts on where rates should be?
Yeah, and I think it is a complement to the rate policy. I'm hopeful that we'll get, and I do think that we've gotten some downward pressure or upward pressure on longer term interest rates through this channel. I think the econometric estimates are, all over the map. They're very wide. So we'll see. One thing that I think may be pretty effective here is that this is a global quantitative tightening. And so you've got many central banks moving in the same direction here all at once. That may push longer term yields higher and help us keep inflation under control globally.
The St. Louis Cardinals have had a spectacular August. There's no question
They're
about
looking like the best team in baseball right now.
And they've got a manager who is unique, young, and different. He has a communication strategy that is original. What's the next communication strategy for the Fed? Is there too much communication now?
I think we do a great job because I think it's good to have a big committee. There's information is coming in continuous time, as you'll appreciate, and you have to react. Markets want to know, well, what do you think about this data point? What do you think about that data point?
Did he twice in this conversation blame the media for the mess we're in?
Only you, Tom.
Just me?
We asked President Harkin whether we should get rid of the dot plot. Do you think we should?
I've felt that we should do something with the dot plot, but we haven't figured out what to do. I have talked with you guys about stepping out of it, but I don't like the emphasis on, let's say 3 years from now, here's where we're going to be. The information content of that is close to zero, so I don't think we should pretend that we're saying something when we don't really know. And we should probably keep it shorter term about, well, here's where we think we are and here's where we're
If you have Pujols up to the lunchroom at the St. Louis Fed, on his retirement, can you have the surveillance team come out to celebrate that?
Okay, you think he's going to hit 700?
I don't know. The home run he hit the other day, pinch hitting in the third inning, was extraordinary. That grand slam was an act of God. What's the grand slam Chairman Powell has to do before the September meeting? What is the communication strategy he needs to do to hit a grand slam like the gentleman from St. Louis?
I think he'll do a great job in this speech here. I haven't seen it, so I don't know exactly what's
Would you like to? Well, you could, it's just this guy.
He's got 20 seconds left. If you want to tell us.
Is there any single sentence you'd like to mention here?
I just said I don't know what's in it, but he'll do a great job with it, and it's a great opportunity, and he'll use it effectively to lay out the committee strategy.
Very diplomatic there, President Bullard. Thank you, sir. President Bullard of the St. Louis Fed. We'll be catching up with President Bostic in around about 5 minutes' time. Your opening bell coming right up.
Most of us don't spend much time thinking about the grid, the dizzyingly huge system of cables, transformers, and outlets that reliably powers our lives. It's an easily ignored, change-resistant part of the modern world, and that's the way we like it. But as we move towards less planet-melting ways of producing electricity, the grid is going to have to evolve too.
We're seeing so many countries and governments announcing high targets when it comes to decarbonization and being climate neutral. But this is just one side of the coin. It's not enough to simply generate green energy. We also need to make sure that this is transmitted and distributed to the end consumers.
The grid of today just isn't equipped for renewables. So a new kind of grid is starting to take shape. The supergrid.
A lot's happening on Wall Street.
I think Jay Powell said things that were indefensible.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights
We think that's the next secular shift.
from businesses most influential and instrumental.
Yes, it's about renewables.
It's a challenging dynamic.
This is a level of uncertainty that we haven't had to deal with.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live tonight with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio. The top names at the Fed are on Bloomberg.
It is essential we get inflation down. People want jobs, but they also want low and stable inflation. We have to give them both.
Nobody covers the Fed like Bloomberg, your global business authority.
The difference between missed opportunity and actionable intelligence. For in-house attorneys who strive to provide superior counsel and strategic advice, Bloomberg Law offers an unmatched platform of analytics tools and business intelligence. All to help improve productivity, mitigate risk, and inform decision-making. For the comprehensive platform that helps you work smarter and faster, the difference is Bloomberg Law.
Come against the opening bow this morning. Good morning to you all. Live from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. In around about 30 minutes' time, we'll hear from Chairman Jay Powell addressing the nation and perhaps even the world on the situation with monetary policy here at the Federal Reserve. Futures going into the opening bow totally unchanged on the S&P 500. A snoozy board for you. Check out the bond market. Yields up a couple of basis points too. Maybe 3 basis points higher to 3.05%. Interesting looking at twos, and we've done that all week. 2-year yields up around about 15 basis points on the week. Just short of 340 rather, before you get too excited. 3.4%. Very, very close to the highs of the year. We've got Raphael Bostic, the president of the Atlanta Fed, next to us thinking 240. John, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? We've done way more than that. Lisa, just short of 340 right now.
Yeah, and how high does it have to go? Is this where it's going to stop? And we were just hearing from Patrick Harker and then Jim Bullard, Patrick Harker saying that this is perhaps where we're going to get to by the end of the year, and then we can hold. Right now we have with us, of course, Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic, who has provided the intellectual leadership for the region and has really been vocal recently about what's going to happen in September, and that's where we have to start. Where you said recently in a recent interview that it's a coin toss between 50 and 75 in terms of how many basis points you hike. What will determine that coin toss for you?
Well, for me, it'll be the data that comes in over the next couple of weeks. You know, PCE today is actually an important one, showing the economy is slowing down in an orderly way, which is helpful. But we also have a jobs report that's coming in, I guess, a week from now. And then 10 days later, we have the CPI. I think the three of those together will start to give me a sense of sort of the big story about how the economy is responding to our policies, and also just the changing dynamic. And if it comes in strong and starts strong, as if there's no change, I'll probably be leaning 75. If it comes in slowing like we've seen today, that's the first piece of evidence, I'll probably lean to 50.
Okay, so is there a certain threshold with the jobs data in particular that you're looking for? Because you mentioned that we saw a pretty elevated number the last time around. How is that going to inform you? What's sort of the cutoff that you're looking for there?
Well, I don't. These things. There is some art here, right? So it's not if it hits 277, then I'm good, right? I do think you have to think about this as, what does the jobs number tell us in terms of trajectory? And the jobs, the economy's been producing a lot of jobs on a monthly basis, 450 to 500,000 people a month, and that's a lot. I think we want to start to see that slow, and that would be consistent with the idea that our policies are starting to take demand and pull it down and reduce that imbalance that is underlying the inflation that we're seeing. So that's kind of what I'm looking for, and we'll look through it to see if there are particular sectors where there are movements that would suggest that that there is some help that's coming in terms of the demand side.
There are thousands of traders on Wall Street who are turning blue now because they're holding their breath, waiting for the chairman's speech. And I wonder, given the disconnect that we've seen between Wall Street and the Fed and the fact that financial conditions have loosened, what's the message that you would like them to take away from the chairman's speech today?
Well, I think the message is inflation is high, inflation is too high, and we're going to do what we need to do to bring it down. And we're going to be resolute in our policy to make sure that inflation is well on its way to our 2% target. And I think that is the basic message. We've been saying that already, right? So that's not a new message, but it is important for us to be continuing to reinforce that so that there is an uncertainty about what we're going to do. We're still in a pandemic economy. I try to remind everybody that. And one of the things that's been true is that the unexpected has happened repeatedly. And so I would like for our policy, and I think my colleagues share this, to not be contributing to that uncertainty. We want people to understand sort of what our reaction function is and what we're trying to get to, and that we're not going to bounce around. We're going to be stable, resolute, and sure about where we want to be.
Well, are you willing in Wall Street parlance to be Volcker, to let the economy go into recession if you need to focus more on inflation, bringing that down because the costs are higher?
Well, inflation is extremely high, sort of unimaginable. The levels we're at were unimaginable 18 months ago. And so we have to get that under control. That's job one. That's our top priority. Beyond that, if we start to see weakening in labor markets, but inflation is still too high, we've got to get inflation down. Like, that is the first thing. So I'd be comfortable with some weakness in labor markets if we start to see some job losses. But to be honest, we're far from that today, right? There's a lot of momentum in terms of job creation. And so I'm going to focus on the next month and the month after that. And, I think we won't have to face a question like that for quite some time.
Well, to put three questions together into one about the terminal rate, what do you think you need to get to? How fast do you need to get there? And then how long do you leave it there?
So that's three questions at once, right?
So you got to do it well.
And I'm supposed to do this in a short. I know we don't have 20 minutes.
No, you've got 8 minutes to answer that.
So go ahead.
Oh, then I got time. I'll
Take your time. Relax.
Right. So for me, I think I want to see our policy get to something that's marginally restrictive. I think right now we are still in a somewhat accommodative state weekly. So I'm looking for us to move maybe 100 basis points, maybe 125 basis points from where we are in terms of that movement. I'd like to get there sooner rather than later. I think that the sooner we get to that level, the faster and the more dramatic our impact will be on the economy. But I also want to do it in an orderly way. I want to get to that terminal rate in an orderly way so that the markets and businesses and families don't think that our movement is suggesting there's some underlying weakness or something unexpected that's going to make people be concerned. And then in terms of staying there, I think we should stay there for a long time. And I would say I want to see the signs of the economy slowing be clear, but also start to see inflation really moving down to closer to our 2% target before we contemplate sort of moving at all. So, the word I'm using a lot is resolute. I think once we get to that level, we want to be resolute in our goal, which is to get inflation down to our target.
I've got to ask this because you mentioned a time. You said a long time. What's a long time?
Oh, it could be 5 days,
Precisely. You went there. I didn't ask the question. You went there.
Right. So for me, I think what my team has told me and what we've seen historically is that it takes a long time for the actual inflation numbers to move. The economy's got to weaken in a lot of ways. It's got to slow down. And on some level, the inflation number is the last number to move. And so where I am right now on this is, from a typical perspective, we would expect maybe 18 months, 2 years for that trajectory. But at the same time, if you look at how financial markets responded to our policy when we started moving in March, it moved much faster than we've seen historically. And we know that in the pandemic, the economy has evolved faster than we expected historically. GDP responded much faster than the analysts were expecting at the outset. So there is the possibility that the movement in inflation could be faster than what we've seen in the past. The reality is, we don't know what's going to happen.
We don't.
Right? And so I want people to know that we're really focused on the goal. And the goal is to see that inflation move. I'm hopeful it goes faster, but I can't say that for sure. So we're going to just have to wait and see.
I think what we all need then is not the crystal ball, it's just a deeper understanding of your reaction function. And we kind of danced around it just a little bit. Can you help me understand the following? If the mandate is in conflict at any point in the next 12 months, if inflation is still too sticky, but the growth side of things, the labor market starts moving in the wrong direction, do you need to tolerate that to get this lower? Is that something you're willing to tolerate?
Sure, we have to be open to that as a possibility. Look, if inflation is far from the target and labor markets and employment is relatively close to target or on target, some would say we already overshot the target, we should be willing, I would be willing, to see that those employment numbers moderate to get us either back to target if we've overshot or maybe a little further away from the target. But that further away right now is still extremely close. And so my concerns in terms of our mandate are not very heavily weighted on the labor market side, much more in inflation.
There's a belief that seems to be embedded in markets that we're going back to what we knew 10 years ago in terms of inflation being low, growth being slow, and that just sort of being the normalcy, and that rates will eventually go back to what they were accustomed to, say back then. Do you disagree with this? I mean, this is one of the fundamental questions. Are we in for a sea change in how much inflation there is globally and in the United States?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I actually think it's an open question. If you think about what's happened through the pandemic, where we've discovered that supply chain strategies, where you're relying on just one supplier, increases exposure to volatility and outcome and outputs. Businesses are changing those strategies. The ones I talk to, they say, look, we're no longer going to rely on just one supplier, that lowest cost provider, and we're going to do this across a number of different suppliers. That, in and of itself, means we're going to have higher cost basis. There's going to be upward pressure on prices that we're going to have to embrace. And so there's a lot of other things that are going on in the economy, such that it's very difficult to project that. And so I would say, I think inflation is going to wind up being a little higher than what we've seen historically. How much higher, and is it going to be material? I think we're just going to have to let things play out to understand that.
So going back to John's question about how long, and you said, could be, typically it was 18 to 20 minutes, 20 to 2 years, 18 to 20 minutes, exactly, why don't we bring it down? 5 days, a month, or, it's been 18 to 2 years. Could it be much longer than that? Could it be that the new Fed funds rate eventually evolves to something closer to 3 to 3.5%? Is that something feasible? Not just could, but is it feasible in your framework?
Well, I think it's possible, but a lot's going to happen between now and when we get to that place, to where I'll be able to have an understanding or a sense of whether that's a new permanent and whether there is some new kind of floor that we're going to have to push to. But I don't know that now. The thing that's been helpful, like conversations like this are actually quite helpful in making me be sensitive about what sorts of things we need to be focusing on, me and my team need to be focusing on, as the economy evolves for the next couple of years. So I know they're watching this, so this will be something that shows up on their list of things to do over the next 6 to 12 months.
We've got about 90 seconds left. I want to squeeze this in because we had the discussion with President Bullard as well. Where does balance sheet reduction fit in? I get so many questions from Bloomberg subscribers about this almost every day. Why aren't we talking about this more? Why aren't we talking about this more? Where does it fit in?
Well, I think it fits in as an additional tool to policy, and the reduction of the balance sheet will have sort of a more restrictive impact on how the economy evolves. We are very early on in the reduction of our balance sheet, and we're still ramping up in some regards to get to a level of that we can start to reduce much faster. For me, I think that it is another factor that allows us to say the economy standing on its own. It doesn't need these additional supports.
Yeah.
And so the energy in the marketplace is just less. And that's kind of how it plays out. I saw the segment you did with Jim, and trying to come up with a hard estimate about $100 billion. What does that translate? It's very difficult.
It's super hard.
But I think it's unambiguous that there's less energy that we are contributing to the marketplace, and that means that the ability for the economy to grow faster is just going to weaken.
We've got to go, but I'm told you and I are going to watch some real football in Atlanta at some point.
Come on down.
Today, what are the biggest challenges for General Dynamics, and what are the biggest opportunities?
So I think in any business, the challenges are solving complex problems that come to you. The problems that come to me and my senior leadership team for resolving tend to be highly complex and nettlesome. So your ability to solve those complex problems are an important element, I think, of the value that we add to the company. And then I think opportunities, you always want to make sure that you've got a creative enough mind, an open enough mind to be able to see around square corners. What am I missing? The why questions are really powerful. Why are we not doing this, or why are we doing this? I ask those questions a lot, and in the answers, you can sometimes tease out some real opportunities, some hidden things. But thinking creatively about opportunities and problems is really important.
And what about the industry generally? Do you think they have big challenges now as the defense budget probably comes down a bit?
So I think that we are all responsible, and we have an obligation to find the latest and best technologies that we can for our customers and deliver them in the most cost-effective manner we can. And I think that that's a challenge and an opportunity for all of the big defense companies.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
There's a sense it'll get to 7% in the coming months. Do you see that coming true?
There was something of a grey zone battle between Taiwan and China.
Where are the job cuts to come from? We will not just cut and run.
With unmatched reach and resources from more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, your global business authority.
Live from Jackson Hole, Wyoming this morning. Good morning to you all. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on TV and radio alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Brownbitz. I'm Jonathan Farrow. Moments from now, about 13 minutes away, we'll hear from the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell. We've caught up with the good and the great over the last 48 hours. And TK, this one's the big one, isn't it?
It's a big speech, but what's interesting is how it will be interpreted, and that's wrapped around data. I can't emphasize enough how we've shifted from forward guidance and blah, blah, blah.
You're happy to move away from the blah.
The data matters. Like, guess what we got? Good inflation
You've
this
filled
morning.
the gaps in, Tom. I'll give you that.
Good.
They've taken away the blah, blah, blah.
I'm trying to channel you. I took my raincoat
I like that.
off.
This is a better look.
You know, well, it's a little warmer.
What did we learn, Lisa? What did we learn?
Over the past hour, honestly, we've learned that there is more of a likelihood that they want to keep rates at a higher level for longer. That, to me, has been the big takeaway.
Well, this is what we've also learned this morning. Beijing and Washington have reached a preliminary agreement to allow American officials to review audit documents of Chinese businesses that trade in the United States. This has been a massive, massive issue for a long, long time. I'm pleased to say that dropping by to catch us up with us very, very quickly is Gary Gensler, the SEC chair. Gary, great to catch up. So I feel like I've been talking about this for at least a decade. Is this the one? Is this the one?
Well, this, as I've been saying, this proof will still be in the pudding, but this is unprecedented. Tom just said something about the data, and I'm not talking about the data that you were referencing, but when investors invest in companies, they need to ensure they look at financial data, and they need to know that that financial data has been checked by auditors. And guess what? That the auditors have somebody looking over their shoulder as well, that there's somebody auditing the auditors. And that's our basic system of checking data in our capital markets. And 20 years ago, Congress passed a law, and 20 years later, the Chinese still had not complied with that law about allowing inspections of the auditors. We have this unprecedented arrangement signed this morning, but we still need to see over the next several months whether there'll be compliance and whether our inspectors from the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board will be able to do the inspections when they go to Asia.
Yeah, Gary, can you give us a sense of what went on behind the scenes to get to this point? What did the U.S. have to give up to get China to allow this type of oversight?
Lisa, it's actually a little bit different than that. It's that we have the world's deepest, most liquid capital markets. And I think that Congress stepping in December of 2020 and then reaffirming again in the summer of 21, and my shout out to Senators Van Hollen and Senator Kennedy, bipartisan, who led that effort, to say that there was a clock, that there was going to be a 3-year clock. If China didn't comply, all 200 of these companies are going to have to leave our U.S. capital markets. And then the SEC and this other organization, the PCOB, in the last year and a half have been really effectuating the will of Congress. And I think when we Americans speak with one, bipartisan voice, unanimous voice from Congress, from the SEC and the PCOB, I think the Chinese had to take a look at this and say, you know what, we want to continue to have this access. So actually the agreement is more prescriptive, more detailed, more specific than any that are with any other country, because we've had, as John said, these 10 or 15 years of non-compliance. And the proof will be in the pudding. But I do want to say that it's been constructive, productive conversations with the Ministry of Finance from China, with what's called the CSRC, the China Securities Regulatory Commission. we were always into problem solving. How can we get to the important compliance? It's a simple idea that we can check the auditor's work papers, we can take testimony, that we can select whatever.
It's been so simple for so long. I feel like it's ridiculous that we've only just been able to come to an agreement, and I know you think exactly the same way. I've got to squeeze this in because the chairman's going to speak any moment from now, so in just 60 seconds if you can. You said the proof is in the pudding. When is the pudding served? When do I know that this is actually a success? When will you know?
So we'll be sending the inspectors, these PCOB inspectors, starting mid-September. It normally takes about 3 months to finish up that work. So by December, I think we will know for this year whether it's a thumbs up or if it's a thumbs down. Then, of course, then these companies may need to leave the U.S. markets.
Gary Gensler, thank you so much for joining us on this historic day. Greatly, greatly appreciate it. And
Thank
now,
you, and good
importantly,
luck with the
Jason
rest of your
Furman
day.
with us. Thank you, Gary. Greatly appreciate that. And joining us now, Jason Furman, who has stole the dialogue of the last few days with incredibly important comments on some of the legislation and decisions we've seen in Washington. Jason, on Wednesday, you will be at the acclaimed EC10 of your Harvard. You will be teaching core economics to young, eager freshmen. How will you fold the student loan debate that you are so critical of into classic EC10 lecture?
Look, I don't think we're going to get to that one in the first lecture, but one thing we really get our students to think hard about is separate your values, how you think the world, you'd like the world to work from how it actually works. You see that in monetary policy too. You know, I root every day for higher wages and lower unemployment, but if the world doesn't work the way that all is consistent with low inflation, well, you have to deal with the world as it is, not the world as you want it to be.
You've been both sides of this, on the economic side and also on the policy side as well. Where did the Democratic Party go wrong on this?
On student loan debt relief, we're just, in an economy where we are now, the Hippocratic Oath should apply. And $500 billion, twice the campaign promise of relief for student loans, which are really targeted, going up to people who make up to $250,000, couples that make up to $250,000, that just violates the Hippocratic Oath.
I think people have mischaracterized what you've said this week, and I want to give the opportunity to talk to our audience about what you actually think this will do, how it will contribute to inflation. You've been quite precise with numbers, so let's take the opportunity to go through those numbers. What do you think it actually means for inflation?
Yeah, I think relative to a world where interest payments were resumed, and that was what was supposed to happen, absent this, the inflation rate will be maybe 0.2 or 0.3 percentage point higher. You can call that a small number for inflation if you want. It's sort of a rounding error compared to the huge thing we have. Or you could say, you know what, when you're above where you want to be, you really don't want to be moving in that direction, and it's about $200 a household. But that's my number. If people want to argue what adjective to use, I have no expertise in adjectives. Mine is in numbers.
We're about 5 minutes away from Fed Chair Jay Powell coming out and talking, and this relates very directly to what he's going to talk about in terms of the longer run inflation rate and what they have to do to combat that. Are you in the camp that there's going to be a protracted new period of inflation that perhaps has not trickled into the market zeitgeist as much as it should have?
I think there's a lot of persistence in the inflation right now. You look at compensation growth, it's running at about 5.5% a year. You just can't have that level of compensation growth without an inflation rate of about 4%. And so the question is, why would compensation start growing more slowly? Maybe that magically happens, job openings come down, soft landing and all of that. Historically, that
China's military power has been growing at an incredible speed over the last 20 years.
A strong country must have a strong military, as only then can it guarantee the security of the nation.
In terms of sphere of influence, we absolutely know that China wants to be dominant in Asia. So there is a target to get to that point, to be a military that is a peer to the greatest militaries in the world by 2035.
The competition for influence is a global one. And through a multi-decade trajectory fueled by planning, money, and pragmatism, China is building a military that allows it to shape the 21st century just as the U.S. shaped the 20th.
Is moving both Citadel and Citadel Securities to Miami. The scoop was broken by Bloomberg's Amanda Gordon.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Recently, cryptocurrencies have been very popular. And if a client came to you and said, look, I'd like some cryptocurrencies in my portfolio, what would you say?
Oh, we've actually been really deep into crypto, deep into learning about blockchain and all of the new businesses. You know, I would characterize this as crypto learners. You know, we have made a series of toehold investments on behalf of our clients, both in some of the currency baskets as well as with some venture firms that are investing primarily in the crypto area. I think it has the potential to be completely game-changing, but it is still such the Wild West, and it's so uncertain. But it has the potential to completely upend everything.
Pepsi's Number Fever campaign in the Philippines has probably gone down in history as one of the biggest marketing disasters in history, mainly because of a human error that led Pepsi to print more winning caps than they planned. The resulting chaos caused riots, civil unrest, and even deaths. Reporting this story took over a year, and it resulted in me flying to Manila in the Philippines to meet unlucky winners and to find out exactly what happened back then in the 1990s. My name is Jeff Maish. I'm a journalist based in Los Angeles. I wrote the story for Bloomberg Business Week about Pepsi's Number Fever campaign. The Philippines is a really interesting country. It's made up of thousands of islands. And it's also a country that's very heavily influenced by America. American culture is everywhere you look in the Philippines. They're obsessed with Frank Sinatra music, for example. They love all things America, and that extends to their love for soft drinks, Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola. In the 1990s, it was everywhere. Pepsi and Coca-Cola were embroiled in what is now known as the Cola Wars. It was a fierce battle for market dominance. Number Fever was already a really popular promotion. It had been rolled out in America to great success. And so Pepsi decided to roll it out internationally, particularly in Asia. They thought it was the answer to their problems. They thought it could finally help them beat their biggest competitor.
Look for the winning number in sari stores every day, also on TV, radio, and newspapers. You could be a millionaire.
$1 million pesos, or $68,000, doesn't sound like a lot now, but in 1992, that was a phenomenal amount of money. You've got to remember that in the Philippines at the time, the average monthly income was about $100, so $1 million pesos was wealth beyond anyone's wildest imaginations. Number fever caught fire in the Philippines. Kids were saving up their pocket money to buy a bottle of Pepsi. Parents were squirreling away all of the bottle caps in bags. You would walk down the street and people were going through trash trying to find discarded bottle caps. It was a national phenomenon. Pepsi boasted that half the population of the Philippines was playing it. Number fever boosted Pepsi's sales every month from $10 million to $14 million. It had a huge impact on Pepsi's bottom line. Number fever quickly became number hysteria. Maids were being jailed for stealing their employer's winning bottle caps. There was even some murders over winning bottle caps. People were fighting in the streets over these caps. There were signs that there were going to be problems with number fever very early. Pepsi had rolled out the competition in Chile, and a garbled fax had caused some kind of problem with the winning number. They'd announced the wrong one in Chile, causing riots. There were signs that there could be big problems ahead if they didn't keep their eye on the ball. So in 1992, Pepsi decided to extend the campaign in the Philippines, and they announced that the competition would go on for a few more weeks. One night, on the television news, they announced the latest winning number, 349. The problem was, 349 had already been allocated as a non-winning number in earlier campaigns. So there were literally hundreds of thousands of bottle caps with 349 just floating around the Philippines. Hundreds of thousands of people all across the Philippines, thousands of islands, were finding winning bottle caps. 349, 349.
Century. And in particular, we're drawing on three important lessons that I'll highlight. The first lesson is that central banks can and should take responsibility for delivering low and stable inflation. It may seem strange now that central bankers and others once needed convincing on these two fronts. But as former Chairman Ben Bernanke has shown, both propositions were widely questioned during the Great Inflation period. Today, we regard these questions as settled. Our responsibility to deliver price stability is unconditional. It is true that the current high inflation is a global phenomenon, and that many economies around the world face inflation as high or higher than seen here in the United States. It's also true, in my view, that the current high inflation in the United States is the product of strong demand and constrained supply, and that the Fed's tools work principally on aggregate demand. None of this diminishes the Federal Reserve's responsibility to carry out our assigned task of achieving price stability. There is clearly a job to do in moderating demand to better align with supply. We are committed to doing that job. The second lesson is that the public's expectations about future inflation can play an important role in setting the path of inflation over time. Today, by many measures, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored. That is broadly true of surveys of households, businesses and forecasters, and of market-based measures as well. But that is not grounds for complacency, with inflation having run well above our goal for some time. If the public expects that inflation will remain low and stable over time, then, absent major shocks, it likely will. Unfortunately, the same is true of expectations of high and volatile inflation. During the 1970s, as inflation climbed, the anticipation of high inflation became entrenched in the economic decision-making of businesses and households. The more inflation rose, the more people came to expect it to remain high, and they built that belief into wage and price decisions. As former Chairman Paul Volcker put it at the height of the Great Inflation in 1979, inflation feeds in part on itself, so part of the job of returning to a more stable and more productive economy must be to break the grip of inflationary expectations. One useful insight into how actual inflation may affect expectations about its future path is based in the concept of rational inattention. When inflation is persistently high, households and businesses must pay close attention and incorporate inflation into their economic decisions. When inflation is low and stable, they are freer to focus their attention elsewhere. Former Chairman Alan Greenspan put it this way: For all practical purposes, price stability means that expected changes in the average price level are small enough and gradual enough that they do not materially enter business and household financial decisions. Of course, inflation has just about everyone's attention right now, which highlights a particular risk today. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become entrenched. And that brings me to the third lesson, which is that we must keep at it until the job is done. History shows that the employment costs of bringing down inflation are likely to increase with delay, as high inflation becomes more entrenched in wage and price setting. The successful Volcker disinflation of the early 1980s followed multiple failed attempts to lower inflation over the previous 15 years. A lengthy period of very restrictive monetary policy was ultimately needed to stem high inflation and to start the process of getting inflation down to the low and stable levels that were the norm until the spring of last year. Our aim is to avoid that outcome by acting with resolve now. So, these lessons are guiding us as we use our tools to bring inflation down. We are taking forceful and rapid steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply and to keep inflation expectations anchored. We will keep at it until we're confident the job is done. Thank you.
The chairman of the Federal Reserve in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, with a pretty strong message to this market, to this country, and maybe to the world for that matter as well. We've got more work to do.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And I'm just thinking that the next press conference should be 8 minutes, 38 seconds.
Wouldn't that be good?
That would be good.
Wouldn't that be good? I'll go through some of the price action for you off the back of those comments this morning. Yields higher, particularly at the front end. We've been talking about that throughout the whole week. Through 340 on a 2-year, yields up by around about 7 basis points. On a 10-year, up by around about 4 basis points. On a 10-year, to 3.065%. The equity market's shaping up as follows. About 40 minutes or so into the session, we do pull back, but not in a major way. By about 0.5% on the S&P 500. On the Nasdaq, down by 5 or 0.6%, and recovering, Lisa, in the last couple of minutes.
So what I found interesting, this was the Jan Hatzia's view of the world, what we've been hearing all morning for some time. Restrictive policy for some time. We need to not loosen too quickly. We're not going to cut rates so quickly. That's basically what he's trying to say. And he's trying to send a hawkish message, which was heard by the front end. Now the question is, the pain that he's talking about, do people think that we're still going to get that soft landing? Is that what's being reflected in the bounce back of the stocks that we're seeing?
How many times have we heard this Fed chair talk about the strength of the underlying